Fiona Green was the illegitimate daughter of an earl, who lived in the shadow of her noble family from an early age and spent her childhood cleaning up after others in the old estate. Despite the contempt and hard life, she matured, gained the power of magic, and became a witch worthy of legends, cliches but majestic in their own way. The dull thud of the cane hitting the stone floor echoed through the hall like a menacing clap of thunder, and was soon followed by a cry filled with the venom of contempt. Count Green, standing on a dais, looked at his daughter with cold arrogance and, narrowing his eyes, asked with venom in his voice if she had heard his words. Raising her head from the plate of cold food, the girl loudly said that she had been listening, even though everything inside her was clenching with fear of her father's anger. Her family sat around the long oak table, glaring at the girl with condemnation, calling her impudent and ungrateful. Cain Dell, the eldest son of the Earl, leaned back in his chair and loudly told his father not to waste words on the shameful and insignificant girl. Of all the family, only Fiona Green bore the stigma of illegitimacy, and so she sat hunched over, her eyes never raising from her plate. But fate did not end there. The girl who lived in the shadows and suffered in silence was one day reborn, becoming the heroine of a new story. The child, rejected even by her own family and ridiculed by everyone, turned into a wondrous beauty and gained the power of a great sorceress of the future. But in the pages of the novel, Fiona Green was not a heroine. She played the role of a villain who stood in the way of someone else's happiness and destroyed someone else's love. The story told of a great emperor and a holy maiden whose pure love fought against darkness and would ultimately save the entire world. Fiona was portrayed as a devilish obstacle, a fatal sorceress who stood between lovers and was driven only by envy and pain. In the final scene, when all was decided, the emperor raised the sacred sword and, without flinching, cut off her head, destroying evil without mercy. The point of the sword pierced her heart like a final sentence, and with her breast torn out, evil was defeated, celebrating the victory of a bright ideal. After the execution, the villain's head was placed on the palace gates as a symbol of the emperor's power, and her lifeless body was burned to the last ashes. The soul of the fallen maiden was thrown into darkness, where there was neither light nor forgiveness, only eternal suffering as punishment for the sins of the past. Staring into her cup of cold tea, Fiona Green thought absently about her gloomy future, which seemed to have been decided for her long ago. Suddenly the Count spoke. The Emperor demanded a magician from their house to send him north, straight into the heart of the coming brutal war. He clarified that he was talking about the Green family, and as soon as these words were spoken, an oppressive silence, heavy as lead, reigned at the table. The girl slowly raised her head, and surprise trembled in her reddened eyes. After all, there was still 6 years of development left before her finest hour. At that time, a brutal war raged in the world between the Empire and monsters bringing chaos and destruction, and the front required more and more magicians. The Count, pursing his lips, coldly concluded one of his children would be sent to the front lines to fight for the honor of the family and the will of the emperor. The eldest son, a fair-haired youth with bright, shining eyes, shuddered with sudden fear. He was afraid that the choice would fall on him. The Green family had long wielded magic, and now duty demanded that one of them sacrifice themselves for the war on the distant northern front. A heavy and merciless question rang out in the hall. Which of the 4 children of the Green family would be chosen to go to the bloody war? When asked if anyone would be willing to volunteer to go to the front and fight, everyone remained silent until a boy surreptitiously bumped his sister's elbow. Smiling sarcastically, he said mockingly that she could be sent away without any problem, like no one would feel sorry anyway, only the air would be cleaner. Her relatives looked down on her, not their blood, not their mind. Stupid, useless, not fit for anything except being a victim on the battlefield. She sat quietly, like a forgotten doll with torn tags lying on the floor, unwanted and without a voice. And suddenly, Cain Dell, grabbed her wrist, lifted her over the table, and loudly declared that his sister herself dreamed of going to war with monsters. The face of this scoundrel was distorted by a vile and malicious expression, as if his entire being was permeated with darkness and betrayal without a trace. Count Green smiled broadly and smugly, as if he had planned this dirty trick involving his son in advance, and with cold joy approved of the volunteer. Fiona gloomily pulled her hand out of his grip, not hiding her anger. No one had given her a say, and it was as if the decision had already been made without her. The elder sister added with icy certainty that Kane was to inherit the family line, and she herself was getting married, so let Fiona go. Jane turned away silently, without saying a word of objection when they told him that he too would soon be engaged and was not fit to fight monsters. Fiona Green screamed in pain in her mind. She had been betrayed. She had been left with no choice, as if she were just a burden, a stranger among her family. Under the watchful and angry gaze of her family, she did not dare to utter a word in her defense, fearing to provoke even greater contempt and anger from those around her. Struggling to express even a shred of her opinion, she frowned and opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat, constrained by fear and despair. From birth, she was given no choice. Even the maids treated her roughly, pushing and ignoring her existence as if she were extra weight. Fiona slept in a small, cold and damp room, on a narrow bed, where darkness and loneliness enveloped her like an impenetrable night blanket. According to the book's plot, the girl grew up in a family that hated her with all their hearts and was constantly subjected to cruel bullying. Her family smiled broadly with cold joy when Fiona finally agreed with their opinion, as if submitting to a silent will and fate. Fiona clutched the fabric of her dress at her knees with her fingers, knowing that if she refused, prison awaited her, a terrible place where there was no hope of salvation. The girl bowed her head, barely holding back her tears, because bitterness and melancholy were fighting inside her, weighing heavily on her fragile heart. Then the villainess, who once lived in this body, probably felt the same pain and sadness that the maiden does now, deep and almost unbearable. Fiona Green looked wearily at the world around her, as if she was seeing it for the last time, as she entered the room and took a timid step through the open door. She understood that she had just passed from one world into another, where her life was just the plot of a book, invented and written by herself with cold determination. She was the creator of this world, the author of every line of fate, including the Green family, which existed only by her will and imagination. Her name still echoed in the air as she walked out the door without looking back, leaving behind a room, a person, and an entire part of her life, as if closing behind her not just a door, but an entire chapter she never intended to return to. Before her lay the harsh front of Halen, cold snow, a gloomy palace, and a huge wall, like a shield guarding the secrets of the Duke and his lands. Fiona walked slowly along the stone corridor, looking alone at the dark walls of the castle, feeling the weight of history and the trials ahead. Her family had forced her to go to this gloomy palace, and she walked forward with the knight, whose dark cloak fluttered in the darkness of the dungeon. Bowing his head politely, the young knight pointed the way forward, as if gently guiding the girl to the inevitable fate that awaited her beyond the next door. They stopped in front of a huge door, which was several times taller than a man, like a gate to another mysterious and enigmatic world. Fiona Green stood there, gaping and amazed, staring at the entrance as if she couldn't believe her eyes and expecting the wonders hidden behind the massive opening. Slowly the doors began to open and soft light flowed through the cracks, as if inviting one to enter a space filled with mystery and grandeur. The beauty walked forward, overcome with delight, her eyes wide open as she saw all the splendor and mysteries hidden within the hall. Inside the room, Abel Halen sat on the throne, a handsome, aloof aristocrat, his legs crossed and his gaze fixed on those entering. Fiona stood awkwardly in front of him as he coldly remarked that he had expected the help of a genius mage, not a skinny child who was too young to play the game. In the future, Abel Halen will become the protagonist's mentor, teaching him the art of magic and wisdom, opening the way to a great destiny. The man was an interesting character in the book, a loyal protector of the Emperor, always standing behind him and protecting him from any danger. Pointing his finger at the bound youth lying at his feet, the Duke ordered that the prisoner not be spared, demonstrating his ruthlessness and power over destinies. With a graceful curtsy, Fiona introduced herself, stating her name and family, trying to maintain her dignity in front of the formidable aristocracy. Frowning, Abel Halen asked his assistant Geron what strange events were unfolding right in front of them, clearly unhappy with the situation. The knight, turning to his master, reported that the Count had promised to send a talented magician of his blood to help them in the difficult struggle for power. Abel Halen gritted his teeth and felt his anger grow. Expectations had been high, but the current state of affairs left much to be desired. Fiona frowned at the loud scream. The Duke was extremely unhappy that such a small and useless figure had been sent to help him. Abel Halen rose from his throne, his shoulders squared and his arms spread wide, declaring that he would make the Green family pay for their betrayal during the war. The ruthless Duke of the North looked at Fiona so menacingly that she bowed her head and mentally prayed for him to stop this humiliation and anger. Suddenly, he stood up quickly and walked towards her with rapid steps, as if threatening to bring down the full force of his power on the fragile girl. The little girl looked up and saw how tall the Duke was. His presence seemed overwhelming and almost unbearable to her. Bending over her, the Duke, in a cold and cruel voice, demanded to know why her father had sent her, and not the other children, to fight on the war front. She paused awkwardly for a second after hearing the question, as if she doubted whether there really were no talented mages left in the Green family other than herself. Fiona explained that her brother represented the family's interests. Her sister was getting married soon, and her second brother was also engaged and therefore unfit for war. The man chuckled at her words, acknowledging that the Count's family was cruel, but Abel Halen was irritated that the family was not prepared to take the war seriously. Fiona watched as the Duke turned and left, ordering her to be sent back home because he had no use for children in the war and they interfered with his plans. Fiona didn't like this answer at all. She frowned, realizing that she had neither a family nor a place to return to with honor and hope. In the original story, the girl was kicked out of her family because she had not shown any noticeable magical abilities for a long time and was of no use to anyone. Having suffered numerous wounds and betrayals, the girl decided to become a villain because she was rejected and driven away everywhere, not giving the slightest chance of salvation. Stubbornly clenching her fists, Fiona vowed to herself not to give up and to fight to the end, despite the pain, fear, and loneliness that were gathering around her. Then she shouted loudly at the Northern Duke's back, telling him to wait because she had important words that he needed to hear. The man slowly turned to face her, looking at her with a cold and dispassionate gaze, as if he expected nothing from her except empty threats and words. Fiona declared loudly that she would not be able to follow his order and return home, because home had long ceased to exist and be a refuge for her. A hero must soon appear who will be able to turn the tide of the war and bring salvation to all who suffer from the hardships of battle and loss. Then Fiona will be able to retreat to the quiet countryside where she will find peace and the opportunity to start a new life, free from the fear and pain of the past. The girl boldly asked the aristocrat not to throw her out, but to give her a chance to prove her true worth and ability to be useful in difficult times. Frowning, the man asked her what responsibility she was willing to take on. Did she really think that cleaning and housework were her job? The knight standing nearby listened with surprise to the words of the girl, who decisively declared that she wanted to go to the battlefield and fight as a mage. Placing her hand on her chest, Fiona loudly and confidently declared that she would be of use to him acting as a warrior and a magician despite her young age. The grown men were stunned by her words, coming from a child whose determination and courage unexpectedly turned their usual perceptions upside down. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with thought and anticipation. While outside the window the snow slowly fell, giving the scene a special atmosphere. Then a slight smile appeared on the hero's lips, as if a shadow of irony was playing in his soul, ready to be revealed in the next word and deed. He walked towards the girl, raising his hand threateningly as if he was going to punish her for her boldness, but something else flashed in his eyes, thoughtfulness and surprise. However, suddenly Abel Halen laughed and admitted that this was the funniest and most unexpected thing he had heard in the last long hours of hard struggle. He reached out and took Fiona's hand in his and said that she had some good jokes. Although Fiona herself had no intention of playing or laughing, the aristocrats decided to give the girl a second chance, allowing her to stay here despite all her doubts and difficult past, opening a new page in her destiny. A snowstorm raged outside, the wind drove snowflakes, and the trees bent under the weight of the cold, creating an atmosphere of a winter fairy tale and harsh reality at the same time. The knight in the fur cape who was walking nearby addressed those present, announcing that he had returned from a short mission and was now ready to continue serving without delay. When the Duke asked where the child had been all this time, the guard replied that he had taken the girl to a room so that she could rest and prepare for the upcoming trials. Abel Halen was delighted by the little girl's self-confidence and impudence. Her courage and tenacity inspired genuine admiration and respect in him. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the throne, as if emphasizing the importance of the moment and the depth of his thoughts about the future of this fragile but strong girl. Geron noted that, compared to other girls her age, the girl looked much older, but in some ways she still remained a child, displaying innocence. However, he added that Fiona still acted like a child at certain moments, which did not stop her from showing amazing strength and determination at the right moments. Suddenly, the Duke announced that in 2 days he would send the girl to the second wall, which surprised even his faithful knight, because this was the most dangerous place on the front. Geron knew that the second wall was filled with monsters and demons, and sending anyone there was akin to sending them to certain death, especially such a young mage. After this, Abel Halen slowly rose from his chair, calmed his subordinate, and promised to accompany the girl to that terrible and dangerous place. Then the man wearily glanced out the window where the snow was falling, as if mentally preparing himself for the upcoming difficult trials that they would have to endure together. Coldly and rudely, the Duke said that if the baby turned out to be of no use to him, he would personally hand her over to the demons for a terrible reprisal without mercy. Fiona Green lay down on the bed tiredly, her arms spread out to the sides, feeling how fatigue and the weight of her experiences completely covered her. When the Duke looked at her like a wolf, she felt like a defenseless rabbit, trembling with fear and not knowing what would happen next in this harsh world. Burying her face in the pillow, the girl began to sob quietly, realizing that she was afraid of the very same guy she had once created with her magic and imagination. The beauty dozed off on the bed, tired and exhausted, allowing her dreams to carry her far from the cruel reality, to a world where there is no pain and fear. The carriage moved slowly across the bridge leading out of the fortress, and the horses, breathing heavily, walked confidently, breaking the silence of the cold and gloomy morning. The girl was riding in a carriage when the Duke rode by on horseback, stopped and smiling, suddenly addressed her with important words. He told Fiona with a smile that it was time to back up her words and prove to everyone that she was truly worthy of her path and destiny. Smiling wearily, the girl admitted that she finally understood everything and realized what trials and challenges awaited her on this difficult path. When asked if she wanted to go with him, Fiona calmly replied that there was no point, since she had to walk her own path independently and with dignity. Inside, she was still worried, because before she lived in the modern age, in comfort and tranquility, and now she would have to fight demons and dark forces. Riding on horseback, the aristocrat warned her that she could die in a battle with monsters, and that he would not protect her under any circumstances. Fiona Green responded calmly and confidently that everything was fine and that she was not afraid of death at all, because fear should not control her destiny and choices. At last, they arrived at the second wall of the fortress, where the sky was ablaze with blood, and the ringing of bells resounded over the battlefield, heralding the beginning of a terrible battle. The nobles arrived just as the monsters began their advance, and the commanders' cries to prepare their battalions filled the air with alarming energy. The girl, frowning, asked the man if this was all a joke or some kind of cruel test, ready to break even the strongest. He replied with an evil smile that this was not a joke at all, and advised her to go to battle and prove her worth and strength on the battlefield without any concessions. At that moment, Fiona realized that it was her turn to show that she was capable of being a warrior in this war, although she didn't yet know exactly how to do it. The little girl noticed the ladder, looked up and shouted loudly that she would go to the wall and face the challenge head-on without retreating. Wanting to take in the entire battlefield with a glance, she froze in horror, her eyes darkening and becoming empty from fear and the hopeless pain around her. The aristocrat stood up next to her and, turning, asked about her first impressions of the war, of the destruction, blood, and brutal battles everywhere. Monsters roared all around, blood flowed down dead bodies, and horror and despair seemed to thicken in the air, making everything around unbearably heavy. The knights, no longer able to fight, lay in their own blood, dying and praying for salvation, which seemed an unattainable hope in this darkness. Her fingers clenched into a fist, pressing against the cold balcony, as if trying to keep herself from falling into the abyss of horror and pain that gripped her heart. She thought with confusion that she herself, as the author, had created this scene of violence, blood, and suffering, now feeling the full weight and responsibility for the fate of the heroes. The man noticed her doubts and said that if she was afraid, she could return home, leaving behind this world of pain and war forever. But Fiona resolutely refused, raised her hand and began to cast magic, showing inner strength and readiness to face the trials head-on. While casting her spell, she loudly declared that she was not afraid to fight, and her eyes shone with unwavering determination and readiness to go through all trials. A mage's level in strength were directly dependent on the amount of mana circulating within him, granting him power and allowing him to cast incredible spells. A weak stream of mana flowed through the baby's hands, slowly and lazily spreading through her body, as if it had not yet acquired its full strength and potential. It was the first time she had used such powerful magic in Fiona's body, and could only hope that the main villain's talent helped her cope with difficulties. A bloody sky hung over the battlefield, and dark, heavy clouds seemed to foretell a coming storm and new trials for the fighting warriors. The surprised aristocrat raised his head and asked out loud whether the storm that had suddenly and ominously loomed over the battlefield was really approaching. The monster wolves, surprised and wary, simultaneously raised their heads and growled, sensing the approach of something unusual and menacing around them. A single thunderclap from the sky resounded with a powerful blow, deafening and causing tremors, as if nature itself had decided to intervene in this bloody and brutal battle. This natural phenomenon evoked delight and awe in the eyes of the girl, who for the first time felt the power of the elements, ready to protect and support her in battle. Suddenly, lightning pierced the body of one of the monsters, destroying it instantly and forcing the rest to retreat in horror before the powerful force of nature. The natural phenomenon spared ordinary people and warriors, striking only the monsters that desecrated this land with their presence and bloodshed. The guardians were deeply impressed when they saw the monsters fall under the lightning strikes, realizing that their fate was now closely tied to the will of nature. Fiona, having finished one powerful spell, exhaled tiredly, She spent a lot of energy, and it took time to restore her magical energy. The Duke smiled and said with admiration that the magic he had seen was truly magnificent and an awe-inspiring display of power. Suddenly, he unexpectedly picked up little Fiona Green in his arms, causing her to squeal in fright, not expecting such a sudden and abrupt movement. Holding her in his arms, he whispered that her power was like divine punishment, capable of both protecting and destroying everything in its path. He looked at the girl with disbelief, wondering if she could really possess such enormous power, so unusual and rare for her age. His footsteps receded, his boots loudly thumping on the ground, creating a sense of approaching importance and tension of the moment. Suddenly, the aristocrat walked towards the ledge on the roof, put his foot on the edge, and the entire battlefield opened up before them in all its terrible and massive glory. Fiona, overcome with fear and anger, was afraid that the man would now let her go and she would fall down into the forest, where an inevitable death from the fall awaited her. Abel Halen pointed down and noted that the monsters had retreated thanks to the strength and determination of the maiden, who had brought light to this dark battlefield. And indeed, the pack of werewolves ran away in fear, scattering in different directions, frightened by Fiona's power and energy. Fiona felt uneasy when she realized that all the knights and warriors had stopped and were looking at her as if expecting something important and unusual from her. Smiling awkwardly, she waved her hand at them in greeting and acknowledgement, showing that she was ready to accept her role and fight alongside them. Suddenly, all the guards shouted loudly, greeting her, grateful for the help and salvation that she had given them with her skill and determination on the battlefield. Fiona smiled happily, glad that her efforts were noticed and appreciated, and now she felt like a part of this warrior brotherhood. The man then placed her on the ground with gentle care and reverence, showing respect and concern for her safety and dignity. He then slowly placed his hand on her head, initiating her into the service of his duchy, acknowledging her value and role in this great house. The little girl was embarrassed and said that this was a great honor for her, and she would do everything possible to justify the trust and prove her true worth. Then she frowned when she realized that the Duke had just called her by name, as if she were a friend and equal, which caused a warm and bright feeling in her soul. Next to the palace stood a majestic structure, around which servants bustled with smiles and treats, joyfully greeting their little mistress. The servants greeted their little mistress with kind smiles and tender words, joyfully greeting her and expressing sincere pleasure at her arrival. Fiona herself gratefully accepted the sweets and candies, enjoying their taste as if for the first time feeling the care and attention that was being given to her around her. At that moment, she used her magic for the first time, demonstrating strength and skill, earning the admiration and respect of the vigilant guards standing nearby. Since there were almost no children in the castle, all the maids treated her with special kindness and tenderness, as if she were a long-awaited ray of sunshine. Even the stern Abel Halen changed his mind and ordered his servants to take special care of the baby, as she was too small for her age and needed warmth. And so Fiona, all in a new blue dress, ran forward with sincere happiness in her heart, as if the world around her had become brighter and kinder for her. Suddenly, she noticed a knight named Geron, who came out from around the corner, seeming somehow upset and detached, as if he was carrying the weight of many worries. The man looked strangely depressed, with a pale face and tired eyes, as if he were a living zombie who had lost the joy of life and peace of mind. Fiona decided to support the man by approaching him and giving him a piece of candy, which brought a warm smile and a quiet expression of gratitude from him for the attention and care shown. When asked where he was heading, the knight replied that he was heading to the fourth fortress wall, where the situation was most tense and dangerous. The demons continued to attack the fortress with fury, and things were even worse on the fourth wall than on the second, which struck fear into the hearts of the defenders. The girl decided to go with the knight to help him, despite her fear of demons, because her heart was full of courage and determination. Lately, the baby always accompanied the Duke, who carefully held her under his arm, as if protecting her from all the adversity and dangers around. Cautious Gerin, fearing the master's wrath, suggested that the girl not tell the Duke that they would go to the fourth wall together, and she agreed to this plan. The blue sky, covered with clouds, foreshadowed a change in the weather, but in Fiona's soul there still lived hope for light and salvation in this dark war. The fourth fortress wall was a brutal battlefield, where the sky seemed to be covered in blood and monsters mercilessly raged against the tired defenders. There was a catastrophic shortage of men, reinforcements arrived late, and many lay motionless on the ground, as if victims of a merciless battle and fate. Among the fallen was a young boy with black hair, who lay on the cold ground, barely breathing and fighting for every moment of life on this bloody field. Finally, Fiona Green stepped out of the carriage, arriving at the front, and with determination in her heart, she moved forward, ready to meet her destiny and accept the challenge of war. One of the guards loudly explained that they were currently counting the number of victims who had fallen on the battlefield, assessing the scale of destruction and losses. While the girl looked from the wall at the terrifying battlefield, the knight and the guard were animatedly discussing what next steps to take in this difficult situation. Sparks of fire, clouds of smoke, and waves of fear mixed in her mind, creating an atmosphere of a nightmare from which she wanted to escape, but could not retreat. Frowning, Fiona headed down the stairs, going down quickly to stop this horror and bring some order to the chaos of war. With a slight smile, she told the other knights that she would burn the monsters' corpses to prevent the spread of the disease and to strengthen the morale of the fortress's defenders. After this, the girl concentrated, closing her eyes and slowly collecting the flow of mana in her palms until it began to vibrate from the accumulated power. As if a feather of fate had struck from the heavens, she hurled lightning, which pierced the monster nearby with a roar and immediately burned its body to charred dust. Fiery tongues of flame crawled along the stone walls, engulfing the entire battlefield, where the dim light of the torches reflected the reflections of the past battle. The flames did not die down until sunset. The battle had claimed too many lives, and dead bodies still lay everywhere, covering the ground with a layer of sorrow. Fiona tiredly wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, realizing that there was still too much work ahead and her strength was almost running out. Suddenly she noticed a young man whose body was pressed down by piles of dead people. He was not moving, and at first glance he seemed lifeless and mortally wounded. The boy looked to be about the same age as she was, and this made the girl's heart clench painfully, as if someone had hit her from the inside. With concern in her eyes, she knelt down next to him, leaning over his body, trying to discern even the slightest breath in his chest. With her hands folded in front of her, Fiona began to silently pray for his soul, asking a higher power for peace, tranquility, and freedom from pain and fear. On the trampled, blood-soaked ground, amidst the chaos of war, a flower quietly fluttered, a tiny symbol of life, like a shard of hope forgotten by the gods. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a hoarse groan of pain came from the young man's dry mouth. He was alive despite everything that had happened to him. Frightened to the point of cramping fingers, the poor noblewoman jerked back, not believing her own eyes. It seemed to her as if the dead man in front of her had suddenly moved, as in a nightmare, and was about to rise to pursue her with a lifeless gaze. Her head rang with horror. She felt her blood run cold, because her heart was convinced of one thing. This was a terrible zombie, brought to life in the ominous silence, and now he would rise, awkwardly moving his legs, heading towards her through the debris, soot and grey shadows. But soon, noticing a slight movement, maybe a trembling of the fingers or a faint breath, the confused girl realized that the young man was still alive, and overcoming her numbness, she began to panic and rake through the pile of debris, hastily freeing him from under the heavy rubble. When the debris was pushed aside, Fiona saw with painful clarity that in the area of the boy's stomach there was a dangerous, unnaturally dark wound, and a little higher, at the level of the heart, The skin was torn as if it had been struck by a blade or a sharp piece of metal. Without thinking and without giving herself time to fear, she carefully, almost with a prayer on her trembling lips, turned him onto his side, hoping that this would make it easier for him to breathe, because each breath came with an excruciating heaviness, as if his chest was clamped in a vice. Then, quite unexpectedly, he opened his eyes, the color of a clear sky before a thunderstorm, so bright that for a moment Fiona caught her breath, because in that look there was both suffering and an incomprehensible, almost heavenly depth. Fiona Green, sitting down next to him and trying to speak as softly as possible, spoke soothingly to the wounded boy, asking him not to worry, because he was now completely safe, and she had already managed to pull him out from under the rubble. In a weak, hoarse voice, full of surprise and tension, he asked who she was, trying to make out the face of his savior through the veil of pain and dust, and in his gaze one could simultaneously read gratitude and sincere amazement. Fiona, with relief and joy, smiling sincerely through her fatigue, realized that this unknown knight had not only woken up, but had also fully regained consciousness, which meant that he had a chance to survive after everything that had happened. Even with the blood caked on his skin, the marks of battle, and the dirt clinging to his body, the young man's appearance was surprisingly attractive. His black hair fell over his forehead, and his fair, almost porcelain skin gave him a ghostly beauty. Lying with her arms crossed over her chest with graceful elegance, the aristocrat thoughtfully pondered out loud who this strange and mysterious guy could be. He seemed both familiar and alien at the same time, like a shadow from a distant past that she desperately could not fully recall. Suddenly, the handsome man jerked back, overcome with horror, when he saw a terrifying monster standing right behind his savior. His heart began to beat faster, and his mind was instantly overwhelmed by fear of the impending danger, causing his body to tremble with an unexpected nightmare. Raising himself up on his elbows and looking around carefully, he whispered quietly, cautiously, warning that mortal danger was lurking behind him, as if he had a premonition of impending disaster, and there was alarm and desperate concern in his voice. But suddenly he was interrupted by the loud, insistent voice of another knight, who shouted with alarm and determination to the sorceress that a terrible monster was rapidly advancing on her from behind, and this news took everyone by surprise, deeply disturbing them to the depths of their souls. Fiona, dumbfounded and genuinely surprised, turned around sharply, not immediately realizing where exactly this terrible feeling of danger was coming from, and her wide-open eyes reflected genuine shock and instant numbness. Then, as if out of nowhere, her small, trembling hand was grabbed by someone else's strong palm and pulled sharply towards itself, saving her from an imminent threat and snatching her from the clutches of an imminent disaster that could have turned into a terrible tragedy. Thus, the noblewoman was suddenly saved from the powerful blow of the orc's huge, thundering fist, which fell with incredible force on the very place where she had recently been sitting, leaving behind a deep and terrible dent in the cold stone floor. She was saved from certain death by a wounded but brave boy, who, despite his own weakness and pain, managed to intervene in time and protect her from a fatal blow, changing the course of events at the most critical moment of danger. With horror and cold fear in her heart, Fiona realized that if it were not for this brave young man who came to her aid at the most decisive moment, she would have long since lain dead under the weight of debris and merciless fighting, deprived of any hope. Looking into the eyes of the monster looming before her, she couldn't help but recall her previous thoughts. How she had been sure that the young man had died an untimely death. But now, seeing him next to her alive and breathing, her mind was filled with conflicting feelings of hope and anxiety. Then her gaze slowly returned to him. He was breathing heavily and with difficulty, tired and exhausted after the fight, and she could not just leave him alone, because abandoning him would mean giving in to fear, and fighting in such a state was almost impossible. Suddenly, and with terrifying power, the giant once again raised his enormous hand like an ancient stone monument, preparing to deliver a devastating blow that could crush everything in its path and forever change the course of this fateful battle. In trembling horror and with a sinking heart, the noble woman stared intently at the giant's massive paw, slowly approaching her and the defenseless boy lying nearby, feeling how the cold of fear gripped her body and her mind was filled with despair. With a grim, focused expression on her face, Fiona clenched her hand tightly, full of determination and inner strength, ready at any moment to cast a powerful spell to protect herself and the wounded boy from imminent death and the dark evil looming over them. At that critical moment, mana began to flow rapidly in a wave, gathering in her palm like a living, sparkling flame filled with energy and determination, ready to burst out to meet and repel the giant's destructive blow with astonishing force and precision. After the terrible and terrifying monster, like a bolt from the blue, a bright and blinding lightning struck, and the monster collapsed dead with a deafening roar, leaving the battlefield in dead silence, where it seemed that the earth itself shook from the power of this magical blow. A small and fragile sorceress, with barely noticeable fatigue and pain on her face, sat in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by ash, debris, and bitterness, like a quiet spark of hope that managed to overcome an unknown evil and remain standing among the destruction and darkness. With a grim expression and a loud, confident cry, she proclaimed that the monster was finished and victory was now hers. And her words echoed across the deserted field, filling the hearts of her allies with new, unquenchable strength and confidence. After that, closing her eyes, she felt a sharp pain and burning sensation that throbbed in her head, and a complete lack of strength, as if all the life juices had been squeezed out of her after an exhausting and long fight with a terrible and bloodthirsty enemy. Fiona glanced at the boy lying next to her and realized with a cold, hard realization that despite her weakness and fatigue, her condition was still much better than his. The wounds and fatigue were much deeper, more painful and terrible. Grabbing the young man's head carefully and gently placing it on her lap, the maiden again realized with a heavy and excruciating sadness in her soul that he was losing consciousness again, and this painful realization squeezed her heart, causing her blood to run cold in her veins from hopelessness. Suddenly, a bright lightning bolt of understanding flashed in her mind. She realized who this mysterious, handsome man with dark hair and shabby old clothes could be, like a ghost from the distant past, awakening in her forgotten feelings, pain, and memories. The maiden opened her mouth wide in surprise, confusion, and with a slight trepidation, not immediately realizing who was in front of her. But when understanding finally overtook her, shock engulfed her entire being, breaking her heart and causing her eyes to fill with hot tears. On her lap lay the protagonist of her favorite novel, Sigrin, that mysterious and alluring character whose name rang in her thoughts and whose fate was intertwined with her own, like thin threads of fate stretching through time and space. The girl, in frantic despair, beat her head against the cold wall in a helpless complaint, bitterly asking why cruel fate had decided that the main character would appear right now in this dark and gloomy hour, and not after 6 long and painful years when everything could have been different. However, there was little time to dwell on the injustice, as the young man's life was literally slipping from her trembling hands. He was dying, and every precious second seemed priceless, like a flickering weak flame in the wind about to go out forever. Fiona Green, overcome with horror and an inexpressible deep anxiety, suddenly realized that if the main character died now, then along with him, the entire living world of the book, which she loved so much and in which she desperately hoped to find salvation and consolation, could go out. The scarlet sky stretched overhead, like molten blood rolled in the wind, and the heavy crimson clouds seemed to be harbingers of fateful changes hanging over the world, as if nature itself was crying blood. In the end, the young man lay motionless in a pool of blood, and the doctor anxiously checked his temperature, while the girl, like a guardian angel, sat quietly nearby in the bright bedroom, watching his every breath with hope and fear. Sigrin was still unconscious and very vulnerable. His neck was carefully and meticulously bandaged with a bandage that was a slight reminder of the recent terrible danger, creating a feeling of fragility, like a thin thread holding his life by a thread. With great joy, the doctor reported in detail that the patient was slowly but surely recovering, and these bright words filled Fiona's heart with warm hope, making her smile sincerely, because deep down she was immensely glad that fate had finally turned its face in their favour. After this, Fiona gently and a little timidly waved goodbye to the doctor, as if wanting to convey all her gratitude and warmth of soul for his sincere care and attentive help. And he, nodding in response, quietly left the room, leaving behind a light and calm feeling of peace. Sitting down next to the bed and carefully lowering herself onto the edge, the girl sighed deeply with relief, feeling all the accumulated tensions slowly leave her, and thought to herself that it was a real miracle. They had escaped the apocalypse, having managed to save the main character at the most critical moment. Leaning thoughtfully and attentively over the young man, Fiona carefully examined his face and came to the conclusion that he was about 14 years old, an age full of hopes, secrets, first discoveries and dreams, not yet tired of life's storms and trials. According to ancient stories and legends, this young man was the secret prince of a great empire, hiding within himself a riddle that had to be solved, and on which depended the fate of not only his life, but also the entire world around him. Sigrin was a secret and illegitimate child of royal blood, who by birthright was destined to one day take the throne, although no one guessed it. In the future, it was he who would become the king whose name would go down in the annals of history forever. When Sigrin was still a very small child, his existence was kept in the strictest secrecy, hidden from the world, for no one was supposed to know that in one of the abandoned corners of the empire there lived an heir born outside of law and tradition. His mother was a simple, freedom-loving woman, without a title or noble birth, and for this she was treated with contempt, especially by the ladies of the court and the men who cared only about purity of blood and status in society. Many cold and staring eyes looked at her every day, with silent condemnation mixed with furious hatred, because she dared to give birth to a child from the king, thereby destroying the ideas of order and decency. From the day he was born, Sigrin lived in a state of constant danger, hunted by mercenaries sent by powerful men who wish to eliminate any threat to the throne, even if that threat cannot yet speak. And then, without thinking twice and relying more on instinct, the protagonist's mother decided on a desperate step to try to escape with her son to another country, hoping to find protection, shelter, and at least some chance of saving him from death. At night, when darkness thickened over their shelter, men in black cloaks with torches in their hands began to comb the area, looking for the fugitives, and they came ever closer, relentlessly pursuing them step by step, like predators smelling the scent of blood. Realizing that time was running out, the woman resolutely and with pain in her heart ordered her son to hide in the forest, in the dense thickets, where it would be more difficult to find him, and she herself headed in the opposite direction to distract the enemies from his trail. Hugging her son for the last time with such tenderness, as if she was saying goodbye to the whole world, she quietly whispered that everything would definitely be fine, and, kissing him on the temple, asked him to run away, promising that they would certainly meet later when it was safe. However, before the eyes of the frightened young man, who was just beginning to understand the full depth of what was happening, his mother tried to escape, but was overtaken and killed right there in the open clearing. This moment became the most terrible memory of his entire life. The woman lay on the ground, bleeding hot blood, and barely breathing, looked at her son with a sad smile, whispering farewell words as if she hoped that he would still survive and find the strength to live on, despite this cruel and terrible ending. Hearing the death groan of his dying mother, Sigrin, clenching his lips in pain, rushed to run away into the darkness, barely holding back his sobs, because he knew that if he stayed, he would be found, caught, and destroyed in the same way as the person closest to him had just been killed. Thus, the young boy, frightened but determined, managed to cross the border and escape to the northern lands, where, having taken refuge in the Duke's fortress, he took up service, hiding his past and name in order to start a new life under someone else's cover. It was in this harsh, cold fortress that he first met an aristocrat, a man who saw something more in him and took him under his wing, beginning to personally teach him martial arts, discipline, and the secrets of ancient weapons. At this point, the description of the protagonist's difficult and tragic childhood ended, leaving numerous gaps as if pages had been torn out, and what happened next remained unknown, absorbed by mystery and time, as if fate awaited a continuation. Fiona sat in silence by the bedside of the mysterious young man, peering closely at his features as if trying to understand what his path had been, and simply waited patiently for him to finally wake up, to tell her everything himself, in his own voice and in his own truth. The reality turned out to be completely different, not the way it seemed in her imagination, and Fiona suddenly thought that if she had written a novel about him, knowing that he would turn out to be a real person and not a fictional character, she would have written everything completely differently. Slowly and carefully, with surprising tenderness, she ran her hand through his black, tangled hair, regretting what he had to go through, as if trying with her caress to at least slightly ease the pain hidden deep under his closed eyelids. The room was bathed in soft light, coming through the large copper-framed window, and this light seemed to envelop everything around in a thin veil of peace, creating the illusion that here, in this silence, nothing threatened either her or the young man, who had not yet woken up. Deep down, Fiona secretly hoped that if she treated him with extreme caution, kindness, and honesty now, if she invested care in every gesture, then when he remembered everything and opened up, he would not harm her and would not decide to kill her for her mistakes. Tired from long worries and incessant tension, the girl yawned, covering her mouth with her hand, no longer able to fight sleep, because she had not slept for almost 2 days, all this time worrying about him and silently praying that he would survive. And then, completely tired, Fiona lay down next to him, placing her head and hands right on the snow-white sheet next to the place where Sigrin slept, and, warmed by his breath, gradually sank into a light and warm slumber, forgetting about her worries. A quiet evening wind blew outside the window, gently fluttering the curtain, causing it to move as if it were breathing its own life, and the light from the moon and lanterns cast cold shadows on the floor in this spacious and silent room. In the large room, filled with light and peace, not a single sound was heard. Only the light breathing of the teenagers broke the silence. Both were sleeping, covered by the night shadows, and seemed almost defenseless, like two lost souls who had found temporary shelter. When Fiona finally woke up, feeling a strange wetness on her cheek, she sleepily ran her hand over her face and, noticing drool at her mouth, asked herself in surprise how long she had slept, because the sense of time seemed to have disappeared from her consciousness. Turning her head, she suddenly realized that Sigrin was not sleeping at all, but had already woken up earlier and was now silently looking at her with an incomprehensible, intent expression, quietly, without moving, as if he was studying her, waiting for her to say or do something first. Fiona, smiling softly, tilted her head to the side, quietly said that she was genuinely pleased to meet him, and with kind interest in her voice asked how he slept, and whether he was feeling any better now. The boy turned out to be truly beautiful. His wide open eyes shone with a depth reminiscent of the pre-dawn sky, and his black hair flowed over his shoulders, emphasizing his pale skin and giving him the appearance of a fairy tale hero or an ancient prince. However, despite the fragile beauty and innocence of his appearance, there was a sense of detachment in his behavior. He was partly like a wary, irritated cat that is ready to bite at the first wrong move or word. Sigrun frowned sullenly, silently continuing to stare at Fiona, as if trying to read her thoughts, understand her intentions, and there was a strange feeling of mistrust in his gaze, as if he sensed a danger in the air that no one else felt. Looking down and examining his thin, slightly trembling fingers, the boy finally said his name in a calm voice and then, squinting slightly, asked her how it happened that he survived and who decided to interfere in his fate in the first place. Raising a finger and gently adjusting a strand of hair, Fiona explained in a reserved but clear manner that it was she who had saved him from death, brought him to a safe place, and convinced the doctor to begin treatment immediately, hoping that the young man would recover. Sigrun was clearly taken aback by her words, though he tried not to show his surprise. He looked at Fiona with distrust, as if every word she said needed to be double-checked, as if there might be a danger hidden behind her kindness that he couldn't immediately recognize. His arms, chest, and other parts of his body were carefully bandaged, white bandages tightly covering the wounds, reminding him that he was still a child, very young, fragile, not yet an adult, although life had already forced him to survive like a real soldier. Looking at his wounded body, covered with layers of gauze and bandages, Fiona could not contain her sympathy, and a warm, piercing pity rose in her heart for this hero, who had suffered such a difficult childhood, full of pain, fear, and loneliness. When she cautiously, almost pleadingly, tried to touch his shoulder to express support, Sigrun suddenly pushed her hand away sharply, as if her touch burned, and with firmness in his voice ordered her never to touch him again. And in response to her quiet question whether he was in any pain, the young man burst into a scream, shouting that he was able to take care of himself, and that she should go away and leave him alone, as if caring for him was something humiliating. Unable to withstand the outburst of anger, the girl defiantly poked her finger into his bandaged hand, and in surprise he screamed loudly in pain, looking at her furiously as if she were an enemy, although uncertainty and even fear flickered in the depths of his eyes. At this time, the snow-covered north stretched outside the windows, where a majestic, gloomy palace towered over the white plains, covered in silence. It stood motionless, as if it kept ancient secrets within itself, framed by ice, wind, and silence. Sigrun clenched his teeth, barely holding back groans, pressing trembling fingers to his side, where deep wounds were hidden under the bandages, and, despite the pain, tried to hold himself proudly, not allowing himself any tears or weakness, as if pride was his only armor. With a frown, the maiden quietly but insistently asked Sigrun not to be stubborn and to tell him directly if he was in pain, since after the recent battle there were too many injuries on his body, and she was seriously worried about his condition and further recovery. The guy looked at her with restraint and replied that all this concern seemed strange to him, because they had only just met, knew almost nothing about each other, and she was already acting as if she had been there her whole life and had the right to be there. Smiling innocently and slightly shyly, Fiona reminded him that it was he who, albeit unknowingly, had been the first to come to her aid that day. And if it had not been for his desperate act, she might not have survived that night and never met him again. Suddenly, measured footsteps were heard in the corridor, breaking the silence, and it soon became clear that someone was heading towards them. The steps were leisurely, heavy, but confident, as if they belonged to a person accustomed to commanding and being heard. It turned out that the Northern Duke himself had entered the room, a tall, stately man with a cold gaze. He had come to personally visit the young people, check on the condition of the wounded man, and make sure that everything was going as it should according to his orders. The young men stared at him in surprise, not expecting such an important figure to appear without warning. His presence was like a gust of north wind, sudden, piercing, and leaving the feeling that they were being watched from above. After this, the aristocrat raised his voice in irritation and anger, shouting at Fiona, reproaching her for being too young and naive to bring strange guys to the Duke's house, especially without permission and under such unstable circumstances. Unimpressed by the nobleman's rudeness, Fiona calmly, almost with indifference, noted that Sigrin was not a grown man, but just a boy who found himself in trouble, and accusing her of stupidity or licentiousness in such a situation was simply unacceptable. Realizing that the Duke had been in a bad mood from the very beginning and had not come for a friendly visit, the girl decided to ask directly what exactly had made him come in person, since he had never previously shown any direct interest in her actions. Abel Halen, the Northern Duke, approached the bed where the young man lay with a grim face, and without even looking at Fiona, sharply replied that his visit was connected exclusively with this wounded rabble, whose appearance he considered a threat and an unacceptable liberty. With undisguised contempt in his voice and a barely perceptible smirk, the man rudely and humiliatingly called Sigrin extra baggage, unnecessary and useless, only creating problems, as if he was something unclean, unworthy of being under this roof. The girl stood up indignantly, clenching her fist, and loudly protested, firmly declaring that the boy would remain in her room until he fully recovered, because now he was wounded and weak, and throwing him out would be cruel and inhumane. Taking a closer look at the young man, Abel Halen noticed that he did not at all resemble the native inhabitants of the northern lands. His facial features, skin color, and hair structure spoke of an alien origin, which immediately aroused the Duke's suspicion. Fiona, looking over the shoulder of the irritated Duke, suddenly thought to herself, she had never been interested in who exactly this mysterious boy worked for, because until now he had been only a hero to her who needed to be saved and cured. With his head down, the boy reluctantly but honestly admitted that he had previously worked for mercenaries, participated in their dirty deeds, and carried out orders without the right to choose. After all, he simply did not know any other life, and survived as best he could, fighting for each new day. Looking down on him as if he were a speck of dust under his boot, the Duke mockingly remarked that even assassins had now gone so far as to hire such young, inexperienced boys, turning children into weapons as soon as they had learned to hold a sword in their hands. Tension immediately settled between Halen and Sigrin, the air in the room growing thick and uneasy as if an invisible spark had passed between them. Their gazes held hostility, as if the conflict between them had been simmering for a long time. Fiona leaned closer, pressed her lips to the young man's ear, and barely audibly whispered that the man standing before him was none other than the Northern Duke Abel Halen himself, one of the most influential and dangerous people in the entire empire, and not to be trifled with. While Sigrin was anxiously trying to figure out whether this nobleman would kill him for his insolence, for his past, or for his origins, a finger suddenly poked him in the forehead, a light, feather-like gesture, but a sudden one that broke the tense atmosphere of the room. Surprised by the sudden touch, the boy jerked back and angrily ordered his savior to leave immediately, to leave him alone and not to come closer again, as if her concern seemed dangerous and humiliating to him. Fiona wasn't offended. On the contrary, she laughed cheerfully at his violent reaction, but her laughter was suddenly interrupted when the nobleman's hand fell on her head and squeezed her hair with light pressure, as if reminding her who was in charge here and who was allowed to make comments. Frowning again, the Duke sternly reminded the young sorceress that it was too early for her to be interested in boys, especially such suspicious ones, and that she should think about magic and her studies, and not about who to share a room with and who to serve hot tea to. To the derisive laughter of his confidants, Abel Halen unceremoniously picked up the girl in his arms and carried her out of the room, as if he were not a stern duke, but her strict but caring father, accustomed to protecting and simultaneously scolding his daughter. They could easily have been mistaken for relatives. They had the same shade of blonde hair, the same porcelain, almost translucent skin and sharp facial features, as if carved from a single piece of marble, which betrayed a blood relationship or connection. The Duke was genuinely surprised when, for the first time in a long time, Fiona asked him for something, and not just some trifle, but something serious, to allow Sigrun to stay in the mansion despite his origins and a past full of dangerous hints. Hearing that he was allowed to stay and live in the house of this high-born man, the boy was at a loss, his mouth slightly open in surprise, and he could not immediately believe his ears, as if he could not understand how he had earned such amazing favour from such a cold nobleman. Blushing from a sudden surge of emotion and embarrassment, he sharply poked his finger into Fiona's chest and asked suspiciously how well off she was, whether she had a strange character, and why she had decided to save a complete stranger. The guy still continued to act like a wild kitten, hissing, cowering, darting his eyes and demonstrating hostility, as if any warm word could burn more than pain, and concern only made him want to hide and push away. However, despite this thorny nature, in the future it will be he who grows up, becomes stronger and truly changes. His heart, long closed to everyone, will gradually open, and he will sincerely fall in love with the main character, whom he once despised. The maiden, with a thoughtful look down, held her hands folded in front of her, and the snow-white gloves on her slender fingers gleamed softly in the sunlight, creating a feeling of fragility, sophistication, and purity, as if she were a doll made of porcelain and snow. Fiona, dreaming of a possible future, happily imagined how she would applaud the newlyweds when their long-awaited day arrived, and clap her hands with delight, sincerely congratulating them on the victory of love over pain, loneliness, and fate. The girl teased the Duke with cheerful impudence, accusing him of the fact that one day he would definitely fulfill her request, since he was already carrying her in his arms like a caring parent, protector, and knight, which caused everyone to laugh, but only a smirk from him. Casting a thoughtful glance at the man, the maiden noticed that he began to behave more softly than before, as if warmth had awakened in his cold, reserved shell. It grew through the usual severity, like spring light through dense snow. Noticing that the girl in his arms suddenly shuddered or staggered, as if she had lost her balance or strength, the aristocrat became wary, looked at her attentively and with restraint, but firmly asked what exactly was happening to her, what was troubling her. At this time, the boy lay in bed without sleep, staring at the ceiling, and outside the window the cold night was darkening, and every shadow seemed to whisper to him reminders of the past, which gave no peace to either his body or his mind or his heart, weighed down by pain and longing. Sigrun turned over on the pillow, holding his breath, and, lying with a stony expression on his face, mentally repeated to himself over and over again that he had to survive, despite everything, despite the fear, because otherwise his mother's sacrifice would be in vain and meaningless. His mother worried about him until the last moment of her life, protected him until death overtook her in the forest, where the leaves rustled, it smelled of blood and fear, and she, trembling, stretched out her hand towards him, barely breathing from pain and terrible fatigue. Her gentle hand trembled then, stretched out towards him, and her fingers were stained with blood, as if life itself was slipping away from her. But despite her weakness, she tried to hold on to her son, to convey to him her strength and hope for survival. Stroking her crying son's cheek with her trembling hand, tenderly and painfully at the same time, she quietly and with her last effort whispered to him, begging him to survive at any cost, despite the fears and trials that he still had to endure. A young boy, not yet able to fight the world, was forced to kneel next to her and watch the most precious woman in his life die, knowing that he could do nothing to save her or ease her terrible suffering. From then on, the young man kept her last will sacredly, and, left alone, he went north to where, as he hoped, he could start a new life, although the city itself, cold and harsh, was not particularly welcoming to people like him, strangers and nameless. Hungry and penniless, he passed a bakery where the air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked goods, but he did not have a penny to buy even a piece of tasty bread, and this feeling of emptiness and need pierced his heart with particular acuteness. Then he found an advert for mercenaries in the guild, and without thinking, decided to try his luck by starting to do the small, dirty work that was assigned to him by grown men, wanting to somehow earn a living and survive in this harsh, harsh world. The men gave him orders, and the boy, trying with all his might, obeyed and carried out their instructions. He carried heavy metals, swept the floors, meekly endured rudeness and humiliation, trying to prove that he was worthy of his place among them and would not give in to anyone. One of the mercenaries, listening to the boy's words with distrust, asked with irritation and rudeness whether these words were really just empty sounds for him, meaningless, just as promises and requests were just empty sounds that could be ignored with impunity. The man grabbed the boy by the shirt and pulled him closer to himself, threateningly reminding him that it was he who gave him food and a roof over his head, and without his help the boy would have long ago ended up on the street, helpless, unwanted, and doomed to loneliness. Suddenly, a loud bang was heard, and a bucket of water standing nearby fell to the floor, spilling across the cold stone floor, increasing the tension in the room and seeming to foreshadow ominous events that could flare up at any moment. That's why the young man's entire body was covered in wounds and bruises. He was beaten for the slightest mistake, as if he were a toy in the hands of cruel mercenaries who spared neither whips nor fists, turning every day into torment and a test of endurance. But Sigrun clearly remembered that he had to survive, despite the tired look, the bruised eyes, and the pain piercing every muscle, because it was this steely determination that allowed him not to break and continue to fight, even in the most hopeless situations. The mirror in the room was broken, and the pot with the snake and plants that stood in the corner was overturned. The debris and scattered earth served as a silent testimony to the cruelty and chaos that reigned around, reflecting the entire dark atmosphere that surrounded the boy. The mercenaries continued to mock and humiliate him, laughing at his weakness, sparing neither words nor blows, grinning at every mistake and turning terrible pain and humiliation into a constant, integral part of his life and memories. Sigrun himself sat at the very corner, covered in scars and dirt, silently pressed against the wall and covered with his own hands, because he no longer wanted to live. Despair and fatigue consumed him like cold darkness, depriving him of his last strength and hope. The protagonist was terribly lonely. He lay on the straw under a dark cloth covering, at night, barely dozing and freezing from the cold, immersed in dark thoughts in which the light seemed unattainable and distant, like a mirage on the horizon. Tired and depressed, he pondered for a long time whether his life was worth such terrible suffering and pain, why there was emptiness in his eyes, as if hope had left his soul forever, leaving only cold silence and deep despair fettering every movement. Suddenly, he remembered that he could earn money by fighting dangerous monsters in the north, where difficult and risky tasks paid good money, and this was the only way to change his fate, leaving behind hunger and constant humiliation. So he went to the battlefield, where he found scattered swords and shields, and taking up arms, he resolutely became part of the defense, ready to risk his life for the sake of earnings and the hope of the best despite all the mortal dangers. Risking his own life, fighting monsters and beasts, Sigrun gradually became stronger, more resilient, and more confident, and each new battle brought him experience and strength, which helped him survive and not lose heart even in the most difficult situations. Each time, barely remaining alive, he clutched only one dagger in his hands, holding it tightly and hoping that this small weapon would help him get through all the trials and stand against terrible enemies and his own fear. But sometimes the monsters proved to be much stronger than they could handle and attacked with an entire army. Then they had to retreat, saving their lives and trying to find shelter, so as not to become easy prey in a brutal battle for survival. One of the knights, irritated by the boy's slowness, called him a slowpoke because he moved too slowly and did not have time to react when another onslaught of monsters fell upon them, and this criticism sounded especially painful for Sigrun. After that, he called him useless, but suddenly Sigrun felt a strong blow to the chest from another partner, a betrayal that stunned him like a lightning strike, because from those who were supposed to protect him, he received a fatal blow. He was given over to be torn apart by monsters, used as a human shield, like a defenseless weapon in a terrible game, where every second was a fight for life, and his body became a barrier between enemies and those who could still hope to survive. After this, the guard, overcome with fear and panic, rushed to run away, leaving Sigrun alone on the battlefield, as if he had betrayed an ally at the most critical moment when every blow could be the boy's last. Sigrun, left alone among the advancing monsters, saw them approaching and desperately understood that there was almost no chance of survival. But despite the hopelessness, he was not going to give up, continuing to hold his weapon and fight to the last. However, with a cold and fearless gaze that seemed to reflect all the determination and strength of his spirit, Sigrun continued to fight desperately with his sword, not allowing fear to take over, despite the fatigue and wounds that covered his wounded body. His eyes burned with the fury of battle, deep and untamed, like a flame in a storm, and he hacked the monsters apart with such ferocity and precision that it seemed as if fate itself had sided with him, giving him the strength to fight on against all odds. Exhausted beyond measure, Sigrun fell to his knees in the middle of the battlefield, unable to stand upright any longer. His breathing was heavy, his chest was constricted with pain, and his mind was clouded by fatigue, pain, cold, and the loss of precious blood. His trembling hand let go of the sword because he no longer had the strength to even lift it, and the heavy, cold blade fell next to him with a dull ringing, as if marking defeat, the last effort of which he was no longer capable. The boy himself sank silently to the ground, his body buckling from fatigue and pain, and he thought bitterly that perhaps this was his end. Now, here, under the grey sky, among the traces of the battle, where no one would notice his quiet and forgotten disappearance. Through the dust, dirt, and blood, his hand lay motionless on the ground, and the setting sun, touching it with its rays, illuminated the fingers that no longer held anything, because at that moment it seemed that even hope had left him, leaving only emptiness. No one ever extended a helping hand to him, only condescending glances, ridicule, harsh words, and indifference, as if the whole world had decided that he was unworthy of care, that he was just a shadow thrown by fate into the dirt, cold, and hopeless loneliness. This is why Sigrun himself so desperately longed to someday help someone who would be in trouble, because in his entire life he had never known what help, kindness, consolation, affection, or support were, and it seemed to him almost a fairy tale dream. Because of such stupid, naive thoughts that in the future he would be able to save someone, he ended up being the first one to die alone, unnoticed, unneeded, and no one came at that moment to pull him out of the darkness and save him from a terrible death. Suddenly, somewhere out there in the deep darkness, a soft light was heard, a spark in the midst of chaos, a thin glimmer of hope, so unexpected and unreal that Sigrun did not even believe it, did not know whether it was a dream or reality, a vision or a deathbed illusion of pain. It seemed to him that somewhere nearby, from the very darkness, someone carefully ran their hand through his hair, caringly and tenderly, like a mother in his distant childhood, and this gesture suddenly burned his heart, awakening feelings that he had long considered dead. The crimson sky, dark clouds, and swirling dust above the wounded battlefield seemed like a frozen picture in which every detail was tinged with despair. But now a fragile, barely discernible hope was breaking through them, like the breath of a new morning. And when Sigrun opened his eyes and finally woke up, he was shocked to realize that he was in the infirmary, not on the battlefield. To his great shock, he did not die, despite all the severe wounds, unbearable pain, and absolute certainty of his death. A soft, diffused light fell through the large window, and around it stood rich furniture, elegant, refined, with fine carvings and soft upholstery. Everything here seemed alien to someone accustomed to dusty barracks, dampness, hunger, and loneliness. Sitting up carefully on the soft bed, feeling weak, he suddenly realized that he was not alone. Next to him, half sitting, slept a girl with hair as white as fresh snow and a gentle face. Her breathing was even, and her pose was serene and comfortable. She looked very young, about his age, in a beautiful blue dress with lace and thin sleeves, which made her even more fragile and touching. She was so sweet and harmless that Sigrun did not immediately believe what he saw. Looking at her in surprise and raising an eyebrow, he could not comprehend that perhaps it was this tiny, almost weightless girl who saved his life, although outwardly she seemed too small, weak, defenseless, and far from all this. On a small carved table at the foot of the bed stood elegant plates with desserts, delicate pastries, berry cakes, and fruits, and nearby light clouds of steam floated from porcelain cups, filled with aromatic tea with floral and mint notes. Fiona carefully and solicitously reached forward to check the condition of her companion's wound, wanting to make sure that the bandages were not dislodged, but he pushed her hand away with unexpected rudeness and irritation, as if the touch had made it worse. Stubbornly and coldly, Sigrun reminded the girl that she should no longer dare touch him without permission, because he could not stand it when someone invaded his personal boundaries, especially when he clearly did not want it and did not ask for it at all. Fiona, apparently genuinely upset by his sharp and caustic words, sighed thinly and tiredly, looked away, and sadly noted that he really was incredibly stubborn, aloof, unresponsive, like a prickly hedgehog, accustomed to defending himself silently. That is why, despite the cold and rude answer, she still insistently asked him to be sure to see a doctor if he was in pain, because her concern came from a pure, sincere heart, full of kindness, sensitivity, and warmth. Sigrun was silent at first, frowning and looking away, wondering whether he should say out loud what was on the tip of his tongue, and then he quietly muttered that, in his opinion, she was strange, too soft, kind, affectionate, trusting, and attentive to him. Taking a porcelain cup of aromatic, barely perceptible floral tea in her hands and carefully taking a sip, Fiona raised an eyebrow in surprise and, with a hint of irony in her voice, asked what exactly he meant, because she found it a little offensive. And so, Sigrun reluctantly decided to explain directly that all this seemed too unusual to him. The way such a noble, refined lady, as if from a noble fairy tale, showed concern for him, a street urchin abandoned by everyone. Smiling sadly and slightly redirecting her gaze, Fiona protested softly, saying that he didn't look like a pathetic abandoned cat or a frightened dog to her at all. He was a strong man, albeit hidden behind indifference and bitterness. He clearly saw something in her that gave him a feeling of security, as if standing before him was not just a young girl, but a real, noble lady, unfamiliar with pain, surrounded by care, respect, luxury, warmth, and sincere kindness. Looking down at the cup of warm, aromatic tea, Fiona calmly and sincerely explained that she had no evil, selfish, or hidden intentions towards him, but simply wanted to show genuine care and sincere attention, coming from a pure heart and the kindness of her soul. Sharply, with slight irritation and a clenched fist, slamming it on the table, Sigrun asked with deep distrust and surprise if she had no hidden goals and secrets, then why did she then take such diligent and persistent care of him, as if he was truly dear and important to someone? A cup of hot tea, filled with the delicate aroma of herbs, flowers, and citrus notes, landed with a soft thud on a porcelain saucer, and in this simple detail one could feel the quiet care and warmth that Fiona tried to convey to his rough and tired heart. With a slight smile and a soft, kind voice, Fiona asked if his simple, sincere, and kind desire to help wasn't enough justification, since in her world, helping wasn't a deal or a calculation, but a pure expression of kindness and mercy. Sigrun looked at her silently, not answering and unable to understand, because he saw no point in saving a stubborn, incomprehensible, and alienated person with no purpose, benefit, or hope for change. Such was his cold and closed nature. After these words, Sigrun turned away, bitterly and upset, saying that he had never experienced such deep, bad thoughts about himself, and if there was a chance, he would save another person. But he had long since stopped valuing himself and simply abandoned his life. Fiona was very angry when she heard his words, calling her a rich and pompous child from an aristocratic family, because she considered herself much more than just a representative of the upper class, and would not tolerate such gross neglect and injustice. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a distinct knock. Someone knocked loudly and insistently on the door, breaking their silence and causing both of them to flinch in surprise. And then the door slowly swung open, revealing a new guest in the room. It turned out to be a doctor who respectfully came to greet the lady, showing respect, and at the same time carefully checked the condition of the boy patient to make sure of his health and to understand how his recovery was going after all the difficult trials. The girl smiled with joy and relief at the sight of the adult doctor, sincerely proud of herself and the fact that she had successfully coped with caring for her peers, proving her responsibility, strength of character, and ability to help those in need. Approaching the doctor with a determined look, Sigrun began to take off his dirty shirt so that the doctor could carefully examine his deep and painful wounds. But Fiona gently interrupted him, saying that first it was worth checking how the wounds were already healing and recovering. The girl nodded stubbornly, assuring him that despite the appearance of his body and the many scars, she would not faint and would remain calm, because she understood how important it was for Sigrun to feel comfortable and not be ashamed of his condition. When Sigrun insisted that Fiona leave the room and leave him alone with the doctor, despite her anxiety, she nevertheless obeyed him and carefully stood under the door in the shadows, realizing that he was too shy and needed personal space. The huge room was furnished with rich wooden furniture with intricate carvings, and an upholstered chair stood by the window. The walls were finished with light wooden panels, which gave the room a cozy and calm atmosphere for recovery. The doctor began the examination carefully, taking a clean bandage in his hands and asking the patient if he had felt any pain or discomfort in the area over the past night, carefully observing Sigrun's reaction and preparing to provide any necessary care and support. The young man calmly replied that he felt no pain or discomfort, after which he began to carefully unbutton his shirt, allowing the doctor to better examine the skin hidden under his clothing to make sure that his wounds were indeed healing and not causing any discomfort. After a thorough examination, the boy reported that he was fine, although his body still had numerous bandages and fresh scars from severe and long-term painful abuse he had endured in the past, which required constant attention and care. Fiona waited with bated breath and quiet excitement for the doctor to finally complete the boy's examination and bandage, hoping that the treatment would not drag on any longer and that recovery would proceed more quickly, because every day of delay seemed like an eternity to her. She walked down the hospital corridor, confused and anxious, mentally going over all the possible reasons why the patient's treatment might take longer than she expected, and hoping that everything would be fine with young Sigrun. Glumly, leaning her back against the cold door, she looked thoughtfully at the floor, not understanding why Sigrun did not want to stay with her, why he avoided conversation and rudely responded to all her attempts to start a conversation, as if the walls between them had become impenetrable. The heavy oak door of the ancient mansion remained securely closed, as if it held within itself ancient secrets and intricate stories that no guest could unravel, enhancing the atmosphere of mystery and cold remoteness that reigned in the long corridors of the building. The role of the protagonist in the novel was extremely simple and clear. With a bouquet of fresh roses in his hands, he was supposed to be a charming, reliable, and wise companion for the main character, the embodiment of an ideal on whom one could rely in the most difficult and challenging moments of life. Therefore, imagining the young man as an ideal, Fiona could not even imagine that in childhood he had such a nasty and stubborn character, hidden behind a mask of obedience and submission, which sometimes caused her to have a variety of sometimes mixed feelings. Then she rushed chaotically into her thoughts, intertwining in them feelings of guilt, deepest regret, and irresistible attachment, which gave rise to deep mental anguish and painful unanswered questions within her, like a ball of yarn that could not be untangled. She suddenly had a headache from constant anxious thoughts and painful experiences, when suddenly the door of the room unexpectedly opened and the doctor came out, informing Fiona in a calm and confident voice that the examination and dressing had been successfully completed. The worried aristocrat approached the doctor and persistently asked what exactly was wrong with the patient, but the doctor, slightly embarrassed, replied that he himself did not know how to properly describe his condition and the difficulties with recovery. The upset and thoughtful man told her that they absolutely could not allow the boy to return back to the mercenaries because they treated him extremely cruelly and inhumanely, which could harm his life and health even more. The maiden froze in shock upon hearing the words that although the young man had not told her anything about himself, his entire body was covered with deep and numerous scars that told a story of pain and suffering that could not be hidden. Without thinking twice, she resolutely pushed the door open with her hands and quickly entered the room, as if trying to quickly get closer to the young man and provide him with the necessary support, despite the gravity of the situation that hung in the air. The lady quickly walked towards Sigrun, overcome with great concern about his painful condition, not believing her eyes that he could endure everything that was read on his body and facial expression, filled with pain and fatigue. The guy had already put on clothes once and, seeing her rapid movements, calmly asked what was the matter, trying to understand the reasons for such excitement and why she came in so suddenly, as if she was worried about something very important to him. Fiona, without thinking for long, approached Sigrun, quietly saying his name with tenderness and care, and then, apologizing and a little embarrassed, began to carefully gather herself to remove some of his clothes, wanting to ease the pain and make the care more comfortable for him. Apologizing, she carefully and with slight hesitation began to try to rip his shirt off, trying to act as carefully and gently as possible so as not to hurt him or cause him any unnecessary discomfort, despite all his stubbornness and reluctance. Her hand carefully slipped under the thin fabric of her clothes to feel the surface of her body, and softly, almost intuitively, began to feel the skin, gradually discovering unevenness and painful bumps, reminiscent of old scars and deep abrasions that seemed to hold the memory of past wounds. Without noticing how her fingers involuntarily touched the young man's body, she lifted the top of his shirt, trying to penetrate deeper with her gaze to understand the extent of the damage, although in her soul she felt awkward and heavy from such close contact. Not intending to stop there, her touches became more confident, but at the most inopportune moment, Sigrun abruptly pushed her hand away, muttering through clenched teeth for her to stop, demonstrating his stubborn determination and unwillingness to reveal wounds to anyone. The boy suddenly and abruptly pushed her away from him, and the girl, losing her balance, began to slowly fall backwards, as if slowly dissolving into the air, in which the pain and misunderstanding left after their harsh and bitter conversation still trembled. Fiona jerked back, losing her balance and falling heavily onto the cold floor, overcome by a sharp and sudden pain that pierced her body and made her heart beat faster from the unpleasant and painful sensation that completely engulfed her. The boy winced, realizing that it was he who had caused her fall, and pain and confusion and regret flashed in his eyes because he did not want to cause her even the slightest suffering, especially to someone so dear to him who cared about him. Suddenly, Fiona began to cry, tears slowly rolling down her pale cheeks, reflecting the deep emotional pain and confusion that filled her heart, as if at that moment all the heaviness of what had happened came out and freed her soul from the accumulated tension. Sigrun flinched sharply and, afraid that it was he who brought her to tears, felt a painful constriction in his chest that made his heart beat faster, causing a desire to protect and comfort the one who was so vulnerable and tender next to him. He quickly sat down next to her on the cold floor and began to carefully examine her with concern, to see if she had gone too far in her feelings, trying to understand if he could help her and support her so that she would no longer experience such painful moments next to him. Sigrun, feeling inner pain and anxiety, quietly asked the girl not to remain silent and to talk to him, to tell him what exactly hurt. His shoulders, legs, or maybe something else, because only an open conversation could help him cope with his torment. Rising abruptly to his feet, struggling to overcome his weakness, he headed for the door, deciding to see a doctor to get professional help and perhaps ease his suffering, since without medical support it was difficult to cope with the consequences of his injuries. The girl, not letting him leave, grabbed him by the shirt with a strong hand and quietly whispered that everything would be okay with him, trying to support and calm the young man, whose eyes reflected deep pain from the memories of a cruel childhood and excruciating wounds. It was hard for her to hear that the boy had been treated cruelly as a child, leaving burn marks on his body, as if deliberately inflicting suffering with fire, which aroused in her a feeling of compassion and a desire to help heal not only the body but also the fragile soul. When she asked who had left him with these terrible burns and scars, the boy hesitated, looked down and remained silent, as if trying to drown out the memories and not wanting to relive the painful moments from his past that seemed too painful to him. There was a cup of clear water on the table next to him, and a pain pill lay next to it, a reminder that the treatment was ongoing and that the physical pain was at least slightly easing, but the internal wound was still deep and incurable. Sitting down on the floor next to the aristocrat, he said wearily that this was precisely why he didn't want her to see these scars. He was afraid of her reaction, afraid that she would get scared or burst into tears, and it was hard for him to open up to someone so important to him. Suddenly, completely unexpectedly for Sigrun himself, Fiona slowly and tenderly wrapped her gentle arms around his neck, trying to give him warmth and comfort, kneeling next to him and pressing her whole body against him, as if wanting to at least slightly ease his deep pain. She knelt down, pressing her whole body against him, her heart filled with compassion and tenderness, because she felt so sorry for this boy that it seemed as if the whole world was disappearing around, leaving only the two of them in silence. Fiona couldn't stop crying. Hot tears slowly rolled down her pale cheeks, reflecting the depth of her heartache and sympathy. With each passing moment, her sobs became quieter and more tender, like a quiet rain washing the heart. Sigrun spent almost his entire day experiencing unbearable suffering from cruel bullying, ridicule, and physical wounds that left deep marks not only on his body but also on his soul, making him feel lonely and abandoned in this cold world. Stunned and with deep compassion, she quietly asked him what exactly had happened in his life, continuing to hug and touch him tenderly, trying to understand the reasons why he had been offended and hurt without the slightest mercy or pity. With a heavy sigh and a tired look, the young man finally explained that he was beaten and cruelly abused because he was the weakest among the mercenaries, who could not stand up for himself and survive in this harsh and merciless world of ruthless fighters. Fiona pulled back a little, looked him in the eyes, and, full of sincere sympathy, asked him not to treat what had happened to him as a trifle or a small thing, because every person is rightfully worthy of respect and deep understanding. He nodded quietly at her words, filled with care and sincere support, as if acknowledging that he had finally found someone who could understand and accept him as he was, without judgment or reproach, which was a huge relief for him. In the book that describes this reality, Sigrun was a small but brave warrior who, despite all the trials, threats, and dangers, continued to fight and was ready to die, defending his ideals and those who were truly dear to him. In the novel, everything seemed filled with magic and wonder, like a fairy tale, but in reality turned out to be much harsher and more severe than the girl could have imagined, confronting the cruelty of life through the eyes of a boy who had experienced a lot of suffering and hardship. The boy silently looked at Fiona with his deep blue eyes, filled with both longing and mistrust, as if trying to understand if she could truly understand his pain and support him in this cold and unwelcoming world where few people showed compassion. Fiona took the boy's bandaged hand tenderly and carefully, feeling the cold and weakness under her fingers, and, squeezing it gently, tried to convey to him the warmth of her soul, as if saying without words that he was not alone and that they would help him get through all his trials and tribulations. She silently and sincerely asked him for forgiveness, squeezing his hands in hers, feeling the uneven surface of the scars on his body under her fingers, as if trying to warm his soul through touching the physical pain that he carried within himself. Unexpectedly for herself, the little noble girl, with a trembling voice, asked the boy opposite her for forgiveness out loud, as if a weight of guilt had suddenly fallen on her heart for the fact that his life had turned out so cruelly and unfairly. Sigrun frowned, embarrassed and slightly surprised, asking if she was really asking him for forgiveness for simply feeling sorry for him, since it seemed to him that she was ashamed of this feeling. But in response, she screamed that she was asking for forgiveness not for this, but for something else. The little girl bowed her head, her shoulders shook, and she burst into tears, unable to contain the flood of emotions that burst out, with tears reflecting her pain, guilt, and boundless sympathy for the boy. The young man hesitantly raised his hand and, trying to be careful, began to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks. His movements were soft and caring. He wanted to at least ease her condition a little, as if for the first time he was allowing himself to care for someone else. He quietly and seriously asked the lady not to cry or be upset, explaining to her that she was not to blame for anything, because all the evil that had happened to him was the work of others, and her kindness was the only thing that did not cause him pain in this world. The room they were in had a simple wooden table with a heavy chair next to it, and the whole setting was modest but cozy, creating a feeling of quiet solitude in which one could allow oneself to be a little weaker. Fiona carefully and tenderly cupped his face in her palms, looking into his eyes with pleading, and began to ask that he never hurt her, that he never break her heart and destroy the fragile trust that she had worked so hard to cultivate within herself. Beautiful and sincere, she cried quietly through the tears she was holding back, hoping that he would listen to her and fulfill at least this small request. Filled with trust, pain, and hope, like a spell protecting her fragile inner peace. With a soft and slightly timid smile, the girl told the young man that they should live together and peacefully, avoiding quarrels, reproaches, and insults, because there is so little light in this world, and the fact that he smiled back filled her heart with lightness and quiet joy. But suddenly Sigrun turned away sharply, frowned, and declared reproachfully that the maiden was behaving too strangely. She would laugh suddenly, then cry for no reason, and all of this seemed too unpredictable, alarming, and even frightening to him. Blushing to his ears, the young man turned away, closing his eyes, and said that if she wanted to behave this way, he would not interfere. Let her do whatever she wanted, since it was convenient for her. He had no right to tell her how to feel and live. On the heavy oak table by the window stood a carefully arranged bouquet of bright sunflowers, their golden petals sparkling in the sunlight, giving the room a vibrant warmth, as if a little summer had blossomed in this austere stone castle. Outside the fortress's windows, a serene blue sky stretched out, across which floated a few clouds, and the castle itself, built of solid grey stone, stood proudly and silently, like a centuries-old guardian, protecting the peace of its inhabitants from any harm. Fiona was dressed in a new, elegant dress of a warm red colour. It emphasized her sophistication, and, carrying a basket of cookies in her hands, she walked towards the young man with a slight smile, hoping to please him with at least a small sweet. Standing thoughtfully next to the handsome boy, she hesitantly extended her hand towards him with an offer, and then carefully pointed her finger at the treat, as if waiting for his reaction, since he was still not accustomed to her kindness and affectionate attention. Even though the boy had become a little softer, he still hissed like a wild kitten whenever anyone other than her tried to touch him, as if his body and soul were still full of pain, mistrust, and fear of people. Fiona bumped into a boy awkwardly in the aisle, nearly losing her balance, clutching the cookie box tightly as if it contained something important that could not be dropped or taken away. After this, she flushed with excitement, waving her arms comically, and began loudly and decisively driving the young man back into the room, indignantly shouting that he had not yet recovered, was still ill, and was categorically forbidden to wander around the castle without the doctor's permission. Waving her arms like a true older sister, the girl decisively slammed the door behind him and, with a firm, almost menacing expression on her face, ordered the young man to obey her words, explaining that she was doing everything for his own good and care because he was still too weak and in dire need of peace. Sigrun, looking at her slightly skeptically, could not resist, and sat down on the nearest chair, after which, with a hint of mockery, he asked how old she really was, since she constantly called herself his older sister, but looked hardly older than a child who had just learned to read fairy tales. Modestly lowering her eyes and blushing slightly, the girl quietly sat down on the stool opposite him and admitted that she was only 13 years old, and in truth, she was about a year younger than him, but she just really wanted to feel grown up, strong and significant next to him, even for a moment. The boy, with an indifferent voice, said that she looked no more than 10 years old, and these words, spoken without a hint of politeness, instantly infuriated Fiona, wounding her pride and reminding her of the hurtful words that she had already heard from adults more than once. She flushed with anger, remembering how the Duke himself constantly called her a trifle underfoot, a crumb, incapable of making serious decisions, and this comparison hurt her deeply, because she tried to be responsible and significant for those around her. Sigrun, smiling coolly, bit off a piece of cookie with gusto, and, as if teasing, declared that in any case he was older, which meant he could do more, and he could allow himself to look at her with slight mockery, as if she was still a child. A variety of sweets and fragrant pastries lay in a neat box on the table, exuding the scent of cinnamon and butter dough, and among them shortbread cookies, with jam and small buns with nuts and honey, prepared with special care, stood out. When the boy grinned and remarked that the Duke seemed to feed her too well, and that she should therefore have grown up by now, the girl awkwardly looked away, sighed, and muttered something unintelligible, trying not to show how much his words had hurt her. Resting her head on her hands and leaning tiredly on the table, Fiona promised with a slight smile that she would definitely try to grow up as quickly as possible so that no one could take her lightly or underestimate her words and actions in the future. The boy, smiling slightly and looking at her with a bit of mischief, remarked that she should eat more, sleep well, and not be nervous, because only then would she be able to grow faster, and one day, perhaps, even become taller than himself. The young man was handsome and graceful. His skin resembled jade in its delicate hue, his hair fell like silk, and his facial features, although still young, already possessed an aristocratic precision and cold grace, as if he had been carved from marble by a skilled craftsman. Sigrid suddenly frowned, noticing how intently and silently Fiona was looking at him, as if she was trying to look into the very depths of his soul, and this persistence in her gaze seemed strange, incomprehensible, and even a little alarming to him. The large, airy room, furnished with tall bookcases, tightly packed with volumes, a warm carpet and soft light from the windows, felt cozy and safe, like a temporary refuge from the harsh reality to which they would eventually have to return. Fiona, suddenly perking up, raised her finger and with a kind, slightly sly smile reminded him that when he grows up, he must not forget his principles, because they are what make him special and distinguish him from those who easily succumb to evil and weakness. Sigrid was already tired of the constant thoughts that tormented his mind every night and day, but suddenly he unexpectedly fell silent, interrupting his words, as if an inner voice suppressed his thoughts, and his eyes dimmed under the weight of unspoken feelings and pain. His hand gently slid through his companion's snow-white hair, as if trying to give her peace and warmth, to calm the disturbing thoughts and fears that had long settled in their hearts, creating an invisible connection between two lonely souls in this cold world. Sigrid quietly explained that it didn't matter to him how old she actually was, because the girl clearly couldn't distinguish between good and evil, between real danger and safety, so her inexperience sometimes made him feel anxious and worried about her fate. Suddenly, the door swung open with a loud creak, and they were interrupted by an unexpected noise as someone's hand entered the room, breaking the silence and interrupting the important conversation, as if fate had decided to intervene at the most tense moment of their conversation. Suddenly, the door swung open with a loud creak, and Geron rushed into the room, loudly calling Fiona's name, and his worried and tense look betrayed that something serious and alarming had happened, requiring immediate attention and action. Out of breath from his rapid steps and excitement, the man explained with difficulty that a huge and menacing monster had approached the second wall of the fortress, threatening to break through and destroy the defenses, which could lead to a catastrophe and the death of many people, so urgent action was needed. The little girl suddenly jumped up in her seat, feeling a surge of determination and fear at the same time, and rushed to run away, ready to rush into the battlefield to protect her friends and the city, without thinking about the possible consequences and dangers. Suddenly, the boy's strong hand stopped her, not allowing her to take a step further, like an invisible shield protecting her from rash actions, and his eyes were full of anxiety and incomprehension of why she voluntarily went towards danger and war, risking her life. The young man, not understanding the lady's motives, shouted loudly and demanded that she return, not letting her leave, desperately trying to hold on to her, as if afraid of losing his only friend in this merciless world where every moment could be his last. Finally, Fiona admitted to him with a slight sadness that she was a mage called to war and was obliged to fight despite the fear and danger, because her powers could change the course of battles and save many lives, including their own. However, the boy stubbornly refused to let go of her hand, repeating that it was all pointless, that the war would only swallow up their dreams and hopes, and his heart could not accept the fact that she could leave and not return back to him. Suddenly he cried out sharply, reminding her that asking him to let her go now at such a dangerous moment when the second wall of the fortress was teeming with monsters and death lurked at every step was reckless and dangerous, and no one could guarantee their survival in this battle. Even seasoned mercenaries and knights who spent their entire lives in endless battles and combat sometimes died in the most unexpected places, and no one could predict when and where their final hour would come, making everyone feel the fragility of life. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly across the wooden, vast floor, reverberating off the walls of the spacious hall, as if heralding the approach of important and disturbing events that were about to change the fates of everyone present. The boy, not hiding his indignation and displeasure, resolutely approached the knight, asking him with irritation whether they were really so desperately short of people that they were ready to send a young girl mage to war, risking her life and future for their goals. He stood up, covering the girl with himself like a shield, and Fiona gasped in surprise when she heard him claim that, in fact, there should have been someone else, stronger and more experienced, who would have defended their country, and not she, still young and inexperienced. Holding the little girl's hand and sensing her anxiety, the protagonist stepped up to defend her with determination, shouting loudly to the guards that it would be better to let real soldiers fight, because children should be safe, not on the front lines of bloody battles, especially now. Geron, surprised by such unexpected indignation and rage, froze, not immediately finding what to answer, bowing his head thoughtfully, as if trying to find the right words in this tense situation where emotions fought with rationality and common sense. Fiona, unable to contain herself, sharply shouted at the boy, scolding him for his rudeness and harsh words, which could have cost him immediate expulsion from the fortress, because respect and discipline were above all else here, especially at such a dangerous and difficult moment in time. However, despite her words, the man's hand did not let go of the child's palm, continuing to squeeze it tightly, as if protecting and defending it from the entire hostile world, demonstrating an unwavering determination and desire to keep the baby safe, despite all the dangers. The young man looked stubbornly, with a firm gaze, full of determination and inner strength, unwilling to give in and ready to fight for his opinion, protecting those who were weaker and needed his support in this harsh and merciless world, full of dangers and trials. Fiona, standing behind, calmly and confidently asked her friend not to worry about her, assuring him that everything would be fine and no danger threatened her, because now she was under reliable protection and sincere support, which she had been looking for so long. Surprised and slightly alarmed, he asked her if such a disaster could really have happened, that she could have died if she had not been there, because his thoughts could not accept the possible loss of such a close person and faithful companion in fate. Fiona calmly and with a slight sadness replied that she really had no choice but to stay in the Duke's house. Otherwise she would be mercilessly kicked out, deprived of shelter and reliable protection, and then she would have to wander alone through a dangerous and harsh world. Young Sigrin, looking at her sadly and wordlessly, felt deep sympathy and sincere pity for the girl, because he saw how hard it was for her and how little support she had in this harsh and merciless world, where everyone was left to their own devices. The little girl calmly explained to him that an important agreement had been made between her and the Duke, according to which she would help him with her magical powers, and he in turn would allow her to stay here, providing protection, peace, and the opportunity to find a new home. It was her conscious and difficult decision to go and live in the Northern Fortress, a majestic stone castle that towered over the snowy expanses, where the cold and snow created a harsh yet magical atmosphere for new beginnings. She waited until she came of age with patience and perseverance, so that she could finally become independent and free in her decisions, casting off the shackles of the past and being able to build her own destiny, filled with the strength and confidence that she had been searching for within herself for so long. In the past, at a time of significant change, she shook the Duke's hand, forming a mutually beneficial pact with him that allowed her to gain protection and support, and allowed him to use her unique abilities for the benefit of the fortress and its inhabitants, forming an alliance based on trust. When the young man asked her where her family was, the girl calmly and without unnecessary emotion answered that her relatives had sent her here, to the battlefield, anticipating that she would hardly return, and therefore preferred not to interfere in her fate, leaving her to cope with difficulties on her own. Sigrun felt that this decision was right and wise, for he himself had recently experienced battles and trials, surviving against all odds, and he understood that only the strong and determined are able to withstand the harsh trials and unbreakable fate. The boy said sadly that she could have easily died in battle and was not afraid of death at all, which made him think about the strength and courage that many lack, especially in the harshest and most cruel circumstances of life and war. Fiona tilted her head to the side and replied that if she died, it meant she had too little skill and strength to survive in this merciless and cold world, where every day is a struggle, and weakness often becomes a death sentence, forcing one to value every moment of life. The Duke stood beside the knight, watching them closely and eavesdropping on their conversation, assessing the situation and deciding how best to act to preserve the honor and safety of all who were involved in this difficult and tense moment in history. Before leaving, the girl strictly ordered the boy to eat well and not to disturb his wounds, showing concern and persistence, which somewhat angered him because he was used to relying only on himself and was not accustomed to unnecessary attention and care. As she left, Fiona noted that it was natural to care for someone who had been wounded, as even the strongest sometimes needed support and care, and this was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to true humanity and mutual respect between people. Sigrun remained silent, watching as the girl walked slowly past him, her long white hair swaying gently in the wind, leaving behind a light scent of freshness and innocence, as if reminding him of the tenderness he so rarely felt in this harsh world. When the door closed behind her with a soft click, he couldn't help but quietly utter a request for her to come back soon, as if his voice was the last thread of hope connecting him to light and warmth in this cold and dark place. In the corridor, the little girl had already met the Duke himself and the knight, standing next to each other, their arms folded on each other's shoulders in a sign of calm and confidence, like two guards ready to protect her from any adversity and danger that could lie in wait for them at every step. Abel Halen listened attentively to the entire conversation between the girl and the boy, standing motionless for a long time, like a stone sculpture hiding a sea of thoughts and experiences that he carefully kept deep in his soul. Like a mantle falling on the girl's shoulders, her thoughts revolved around the assumption that the Duke was not just domineering and strict, but deep down he hid some dark side, which made her feel both wary and afraid of his personality. Hearing the girl's sincere apology, the aristocrat fell silent for a moment, as if the words were stuck in his throat, but then he gathered his courage and began to speak, although he stuttered, feeling the full importance and gravity of the moment. After a short pause, he quietly said that he would not discuss such important and painful topics here, and then carefully picked up the girl in his arms, holding her by the waist to support her and show his care and attention in this difficult hour. The bright corridor was empty and quiet, soft daylight filtering through the slightly open door, creating an atmosphere of calm and tranquility, as if time had stood still for a moment, foreshadowing important changes and events that were about to begin. Suddenly, Abel Halen firmly declared that the girl would always accompany him on the battlefield, be close and support him in the most difficult moments, because only together can one withstand any trials and maintain peace of mind in the harsh conditions of war. The three of them, the aristocrat, the knight, and the girl, constantly walked down the mansion's long stone corridor, their steps reflecting determination and readiness to face the challenges ahead, while the walls around them seemed filled with ancient power and mystery, emphasizing the importance of the moment. The long, tall windows of the old house, like guardians of time, let in soft sunlight, playing with reflections on the glass and revealing a view of the well-kept garden where lush rose bushes delighted the eye with their bright and fragrant blooms, filling the air with a sweet aroma. Below, among the green thickets, roses bloomed tenderly, their petals shimmering with every shade of red and pink, like living paintings that beckoned one to stroll through the garden and enjoy the peace and beauty of this secluded corner of nature, where time seemed to slow down. Fiona and her companions cheerfully discussed their favourite sweets, exchanging stories and smiles, enjoying the warm day and pleasant company where everyone could find something to their liking and feel like part of a friendly team. Now, having learned that Fiona was a mage, Sigrun would sometimes cast strange and thoughtful glances at her, as if trying to understand her deeper, unraveling the mystery that lay behind her calm smile and the mysterious aura that surrounded her like a light fog. Sitting in the shade of the garden, the girl thoughtfully reflected that perhaps in the morning he had considered her strange, but now, watching him, she understood that he was not as simple as he seemed at first glance, and their meeting was fateful and special. Standing up, he slowly stretched, trying to loosen his tired and wounded back. But the fresh wounds still often reminded him of themselves, with pain like unexpected shadows of the past that haunted him day and night, chaining him to a heavy reality. The mercenaries from the guild who had been chasing him and searching for him everywhere were still a threat, like dark silhouettes in the night, alive and dangerous, not giving him a moment of peace and not allowing him to forget the hard lot that had befallen the young man. While the girl was thoughtfully pondering how to help her friend in this difficult situation, a maid suddenly turned to her, quietly saying that the Duke wanted to see her, inviting her into the office, where a new chapter of their complex story could begin. Slightly frightened, Fiona stopped in front of the door of the aristocrat's office. Her heart began to beat faster, and she was already mentally imagining what mistake she could have made, afraid that he would severely reproach her for something important and unforgivable. Raising her hand with a hint of determination and a little trepidation, she knocked carefully on the door and, having received silent permission, quietly entered the room where an atmosphere of importance and tension reigned, as if every step she took echoed in the depths of the ancient stone walls of the mansion. Abel Halen, who had been studying important documents earlier, did not look up, but merely nodded in agreement, allowing the girl to enter without further ado, thus demonstrating his unquestionable position and the power he wielded in this spacious and strictly furnished office. Fiona, confidently crossing the threshold, approached the Duke's large table and said respectfully that she had come at his call, to which he calmly replied that the conversation ahead would be long and important, requiring her full attention and concentration and a complete understanding of the situation. Jokingly, but with a touch of seriousness, the noblewoman sat down on a chair opposite the Duke, ready to listen to everything he was going to say, realizing that this conversation could change a lot in her life and in the fate of those close and dear to her. Abel Halen folded his hands in front of him, looking straight into Fiona's eyes, and reported that the boy she had brought home had already made a significant recovery and was well, which was very welcome news, in the midst of the difficulties and worries of the last few days. The man spoke sternly to the girl, stating that he had never liked having homeless and uninvited guests in his house, especially ones like this boy, whose status and background raised more questions than answers, making him watch the proceedings with caution. After these words were spoken, a sly and slightly mocking smile appeared on his face, as if he was already anticipating some kind of secret or conspiracy, and was now going to check how far the secrets that surrounded this young guest extended, haunting him. Suddenly, Abel Halen sharply asked if she had completed the task and let this boy into the house, because he clearly suspected that she was hiding something important about his true identity, trying to figure out who this mysterious young man really was. There were two of them in the spacious office, the aristocrat and Fiona, who realized with alarm and some panic that the Duke had learned about the true nature of her friend, who was not just a boy, but a real prince. And now the situation had taken a completely different turn. With his hands folded behind his head and his head slightly bent forward, Abel Halen looked at her intently, waiting for an answer and preparing himself for the truth to be revealed in full, with consequences that could be serious for both Fiona and her young companion, whose fate now hung in the balance. And so Fiona did the best she could. She smiled softly, trying to look casual, and with a slightly sly smile, said that she had no idea what exactly Abel Halen was talking about, trying to hide the truth behind her innocent mask. The man listened attentively to her every word, gradually realizing that the young man in question was an orphan, raised in harsh conditions, where mercenaries became his stern mentors, tempering his character and will through difficult trials. The girl continued to play the role of naive and a little confused, pretending that she knew and understood nothing, hoping that the Duke would not develop the topic further and would forget about his suspicions, giving in to her simplicity and great innocence. Finally, Abel Halen took a deep breath, as if releasing himself from a heavy burden, and said that it did not matter so much, because in their country there was nothing particularly surprising in the boy's story compared to Fiona herself, whose inner strength commanded respect. After all, the girl behaved like a fragile crystal, at first glance gentle and innocent, but at any moment she could turn into a determined and cold-blooded warrior, possessing incredible strength and courage, which made her simultaneously mysterious and strong. Fiona waved her hand to the side and replied awkwardly, with a bead of sweat on her forehead, that it all just seemed to her like her mind was confused in its thoughts, and she did not want to create unnecessary problems or misunderstandings for the powerful aristocrat. Abel Halen, without hiding his slight smile, replied that these thoughts were just her imagination, and in fact, he considered her a little genius, whose abilities and talents go beyond ordinary understanding, which makes her a valuable ally in his eyes. His fingers slid slowly over the documents on the table, as if he was carefully considering each line, assessing not only her intelligence, but also the potential that could be used for important and secret purposes, hidden behind the walls of the castle and intrigue. As a result, Abel Halen announced that he was going to keep her at court forever, recognizing her outstanding talent, and also entrust her with several additional, very important and secret tasks that could affect the future of their entire country. This news made the girl immensely happy, because now she no longer had to worry about being driven away or rejected. But on the contrary, she felt protected and valued in a world where every day could bring new challenges. If you think about it, Duke Abel Halen had a clear negative attitude and deep resentment towards the imperial family, believing that because of them, discord and unrest were occurring in their lands, which destroyed order and undermined the authority of the government. With a heavy sigh, he began to read the official report, which stated that numerous complaints had been received from residents of the Fourth Wall District regarding the aggressive and inappropriate behavior of the mercenaries hired by the Empire, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The Duke's eyes filled with determination and suppressed rage as the desire to punish the guilty and eradicate the source of these problems, as well as the hatred for those who disturb the peace, turned into a blazing flame, ready to flare up into a serious conflict with the Empire. He then handed the girl a stack of important documents and asked her to read them carefully so that she could understand the seriousness of the situation and also prepare herself for the fact that they would have to make difficult decisions and act quickly and decisively. The girl, taking the papers in her hands, read the entire text with horror and amazement, realizing how serious and critical the accusations were, and she recoiled, feeling a chill of anxiety run down her spine, because now everything had become much more serious than it had seemed before. The documents detailed one of the mercenary groups to which her friend had previously belonged, but then he had fled, leaving behind only a shadow of the past, and many questions which particularly worried the lady and made her think about her next steps. This news greatly alarmed her, and after a long conversation with the Duke, filled with doubts and anxiety, she was left at a loss, not knowing how to act correctly in such a complex and confusing situation, where every mistake could cost very dearly. The aristocrat, noticing her condition, with a slight smile and a confident tone, temporarily granted her permission to lead a squad on the Fourth Wall, as well as officially register herself as a mercenary, which became an unexpected but important turn in her fate and responsibility. With a forced smile and a bead of sweat on her face, the girl remained silent, unsure how to react to this turn of events, as a huge responsibility now fell on her shoulders, and her heart beat anxiously, reflecting her inner struggle and fears. Meanwhile, the fire in the fireplace burned quietly, casting warm and playful reflections on the walls, creating an atmosphere of calm and comfort that contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions and uncertainty that reigned in her soul and thoughts. With his arms folded across his chest, the aristocrat gently reminded Fiona of her friend, whom she had previously met at this very wall, where people from it decide important questions and destinies, and where, perhaps, they will find answers to all their problems and doubts. Fiona, having carefully studied the documents, signed them with a slight but sincere smile and quietly agreed, finally acknowledging that now the hero could truly count on her and her support in all the upcoming trials that they still had to go through together. The carriage moved slowly along the snowy road, and fluffy snowflakes fell softly on her shoulders and hair, creating an atmosphere of a winter fairy tale, filled with quiet magic, tenderness, and anticipation of new adventures. Fiona looked out the windows of the transport with genuine delight, her eyes shining when she saw fluffy white snow behind the glass, and a funny snowman who seemed to be waving at her in a welcoming manner, filling her heart with joy, warmth, and a slight sadness. Meanwhile, Sigrid, wrapped in a dark cloak against the weather, watched her from the window with a gloomy expression, not understanding this carefree joy, because in his soul there reigned heaviness and fear of the future, forcing him to remain withdrawn, cold, and wary. The two people standing opposite him, upset, asked him with concern why he couldn't believe in such a simple miracle, but in response, they heard only silence and deep resentment, as if Fiona's words had left a painful imprint and cold loneliness on his soul. The carriage wheels glided slowly along the snow-covered path, leaving soft tracks behind them, and the sound of their quiet tingling created an atmosphere of winter comfort that contrasted with the tension and inner turmoil that hung in the air around them, like harbingers of change. Sigrid still looked offended by her earlier words, sat with a displeased expression on his face, His lips pressed together and his gaze lowered, as if doubts and the desire to forgive were fighting in his soul. But pride did not allow him to take the first step towards reconciliation and recognition. Clutching his head wearily, the boy finally realized that if he stayed with Fiona during this time, he could help her build a snowman, and this small hope gently warmed his heart, awakening a spark of tenderness, care, and quiet joy in him. This realization inspired the girl, and Fiona cried out joyfully that she would definitely fulfill his promise, filling the room with light and warmth like a small miracle that brings hope even on the coldest winter days and nights. The boy sullenly buried his face in the cold glass of the window, not understanding why he would even play with such a ruthless bastard like himself, because his self-esteem was at its limit, and he felt rejected and unwanted in this harsh world. His hands clenched nervously on his knees, and he, not really knowing how to communicate with people and avoiding their gazes, was afraid to show his vulnerability and fear, which lived inside him like a heavy dark shadow, not giving him a moment of peace and spiritual relief. Out of the corner of his eye, he still watched the girl, unable to believe that she could really be a magician, because her fragile youth and delicate soul seemed to be a blatant contradiction to the inner strength that emanated from her, like a mysterious light in the deepest and coldest darkness. The little girl seemed very young and fragile, with carelessly disheveled hair and a carefree look, like a carefree bird, unaware of the dangers of the world, and looked naive and weak, evoking an incomprehensible feeling of protection in the boy's heart. Moreover, this beautiful girl reminded him of a winter fairy from fairy tales, with her snow-white hair, long eyelashes, bright red eyes and pale skin, as if created by nature itself to bring coolness and light into his gloomy life. The girl was incredibly beautiful and slender, as if spring itself was embodied in her graceful figure and delicate appearance, radiating charm and lightness that captivated everyone around her, as if she were the embodiment of the purity and beauty of nature itself. Moreover, she resembled a white rabbit, jumping lightly and carefree on the soft snow, sliding across its snowy expanses and going about its business, full of freedom and innocence, like a character from a magical winter fairy tale, alive and touching. However, this small, seemingly defenseless child managed to one day overcome a high wall and fight off a ferocious pack of monsters, demonstrating amazing courage and strength that was hidden deep inside his young heart, forcing even the most steadfast warriors to admire him. Before their first meeting, he quietly whispered to the girl to take care of herself, because in this world it is often dangerous to be too trusting, but the lady did not heed his warnings and went her own way, unaware of the trials and troubles to come. Now, being gentle and innocent, she sat quietly by the window, drawing a funny snowman on the foggy glass and thinking about her evil friend, whose mysterious shadow had long darkened her bright thoughts and troubled her soul. In the depths of the mind of the young man who sat in the carriage by the window, a quiet thought lurked that perhaps she knew that imperial blood flowed in his veins, and this thought, like a heavy burden, pressed on his soul, simultaneously filling it with anxiety and a painful expectation of the inevitable. Drops of blood slowly flowed from the blade of the sword, leaving behind a thin scarlet trail that was reminiscent of recent bloody battles and internal struggles, reflecting all the cruelty and severity of his fate, covered in deep wounds and numerous trials of fate. His pale and thoughtful face, previously filled with discontent and doubt, appeared on the carriage window, now seeming especially vulnerable and exhausted, as if he was struggling not only with external enemies, but also with internal demons that tormented his exhausted mind. Sigrun himself had a hard time believing that this girl could betray him, because in his heart, despite all the wounds and trials he had endured, there lived a quiet hope that she would not turn out to be the robber who would one day pierce his soul with the cold of betrayal and treason. Suddenly, Fiona called out to him loudly, and Sigrun jerked sharply in surprise, blushing up to his ears as if caught in a thought he had long since refused to talk about, and his heart began to beat faster, reflecting mixed feelings of awkwardness and surprise. The intrigued girl carefully asked him if the mercenaries had any strict rules or hierarchy, trying to understand the inner world of the cruel warriors and the reasons for their behavior, because she wanted to discern logic even in the harshest and most severe society. The guy explained that only the strongest truly survive among the killers, who then mercilessly dominate the weak, because in this cruel world full of dangers, there can be no mercy or weakness, and only power and strength determine the fate of each. He added that if you want to lead mercenaries, you must constantly prove your superiority by demonstrating strength and determination, so that no one dares to doubt your right to command and subjugate others to your will and ambitions. Fiona placed her hand on her chin and nodded thoughtfully, saying that she understood everything now, because even the darkest truths help her better understand the world and prepare for the trials that could befall her and those she loves at any moment. Her calm and slightly smiling face after the terrible words seemed frightening, as if she had accepted the cruel reality, and this caused a slight alarmed movement in Sigrun, who suddenly felt that her strength was no less firm than his own. Outside, a soft snow was slowly falling, quietly covering the tree branches and slender fir trees, filling the cold air with the scent of winter freshness and creating a feeling of calm and peace, despite the storm of emotions raging inside them both. With his arms folded across his chest, the boy carefully asked the girl why she was so persistently interested in how to deal with mercenaries, as if trying to understand the true reasons for her curiosity and caution in matters related to the dangerous army. The girl explained that this was one of the rules that the Duke himself had given her, emphasizing that she had to know how to behave with such people in order to maintain the safety and favor of an influential patron, whose words always carried weight and significance. But suddenly, reaching forward and gently touching her palm, the boy asked what exactly the aristocrat had ordered her to do, showing genuine curiosity and a desire to understand what task she had been entrusted with, because this could change a lot in their destinies. Suddenly, the carriage came to a screeching halt with loud screeching of brakes, breaking the silence all around and causing all the passengers to shudder, feeling as if the earth had stopped with them, heralding important changes and the beginning of a new stage of the journey. Raising her hands and turning her face to the carriage window, Fiona saw with relief and a thrill in her heart that they had finally reached the cherished place they had been striving for so long, and now their path was approaching an important and fateful stage. It was the fourth wall, majestic and powerful, which rose peacefully above the city, like a guardian of peace and security, surrounding it with its strong stone bastions, calling for calm and confidence in the future. Stepping out of the carriage with her hand proudly extended forward, Fiona shouted loudly that she intended to quickly complete all of the nobleman's affairs, because her thoughts and heart were occupied with important matters that required immediate attention and full dedication on her part. However, suddenly the boy's soft hand stopped her, gently touching and holding her, as if saying without words that there was no need to rush, because trials lay ahead of them which were better to go through together, supporting each other every step of the way. He did not allow her to get out first, explaining that the carriage was too fast and abrupt for her, fearing for her safety and not wanting her to accidentally lose her balance or get injured during the descent. So he decided to get out first carefully to ensure her safety. So he stepped down from the carriage first, carefully, touching the ground gently to check the safety of the path and to make sure she could get out safely, showing concern and responsibility for the well-being of his companion at this important moment of their journey. After this, the boy extended his hand forward, gently giving it to Fiona and offering his help, like a quiet knight ready to support and protect her at any moment, so that she could confidently take a step and not be afraid of obstacles in her path. Loudly and decisively, the young man told the noblewoman that she should hold his hand and slowly descend from the carriage to avoid an accident, because caution was the most important thing now, and together it would be easier for them to overcome any difficulties along the way. Seeing the outstretched hand, Fiona looked at it carefully, feeling warmth and support, but she was in no hurry to immediately accept the help, standing and wavering between pride and trust, trying to find the strength to take a decisive step forward. So together they slowly and carefully descended from the carriage, the girl carefully stepping onto the narrow steps, and the boy holding out his hand to her, ready to support and help at any moment, to ease her path and make the descent as safe and confident as possible. Suddenly, a loud and sincere laugh came from Fiona's lips, which unexpectedly embarrassed the young man, causing him to blush slightly and become confused, because he was not used to such light and joyful displays of emotion, especially in their difficult circumstances. After thinking for a moment, Fiona decided to take his outstretched hand, allowing him to help her down from the carriage, safely and smoothly, feeling the support and care that filled her heart with tender warmth and sincere gratitude for such kind help. Her light hair fluttered lightly in the cool wind, as if dancing with the light gusts of air, adding even more tenderness and beauty to the moment, emphasizing the fragility and, at the same time, determination of the girl at this important and exciting moment of their meeting. Descending to the ground, she smiled gratefully and warmly, thanked the boy for his sincere concern, and he, in response, behaved very tenderly and attentively, showing true sympathy and sincere affection for his companion, which only strengthened their tender feelings and mutual understanding. Village houses with sloping roofs lay peacefully around, creating an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility, as if inviting everyone to forget the hustle and bustle and enjoy the simple joys of life, amidst natural surroundings and wooden buildings, where each house seemed to hold within itself the history of generations. Then, standing in the middle of a noisy city, where stone streets intertwined with green alleys, Sigrun took a deep breath and made an important decision to become kinder and more attentive to that sweet girl who, with her sincerity and care, penetrated into the very heart, awakening long-forgotten feelings in him. A heavy door made of solid wood led into the building, its massive panels adorned with carved patterns, like symbols of ancient traditions, and with each opening a quiet creak could be heard, as if the history of the place itself was coming to life and inviting one to enter inside to uncover its secrets. A man with a neat moustache carefully read an important document, his gaze becoming more and more serious as he could hardly believe that everything written there was actually true. This information was so unexpected and important for him to take it seriously. Sigrun, standing nearby, did not take his eyes off the noblewoman, and at that moment Fiona herself confidently confirmed the authenticity of the documents, and the Duke's seal on the papers shone like a sign of unchanging power and justice, giving the whole situation additional significance and weight. The man pointed out firmly and with a slight hint of irritation that both of them were still too young children to be of any real help in the harsh circumstances in which they found themselves, and were unlikely to be able to change the course of events or influence the outcome of the trials at that time. Fiona, deeply upset and depressed, sighed softly, feeling her words passing by, unheard and unheeded, like an echo dissolving into the void, leaving her alone in her experiences and hopes for understanding. So, with innocent sincerity and a slight sadness in her voice, she asked him whether, no matter what he thought, he was ready to face the consequences of his choice, Realizing that sometimes one has to resort to manipulation for the sake of salvation and the common good, the girl's hand, wrapped in the thin fabric of a white dress, trembled slightly and dropped downwards as if conveying all her inner weakness and at the same time the determination that was hidden behind her fragile appearance, manifesting itself in her every movement and look, full of a sense of duty. And then, with the utmost respect and grace, Fiona Green bowed deeply, introducing herself as a magician who had come not just to support them, but to truly help them cope with the terrible misfortunes and dangers hanging over the fourth wall, giving them hope and promising light. The tavern stood with simple wooden tables and chairs, surrounded by dim candlelight, creating an atmosphere of comfort and mystery, where every guest could hear conversations filled with hopes and fears emanating from the heart of this small settlement. During the discussion and reading of the documents, the man initially hesitated and refused, not believing the truth of the lady's words, but in the end, convinced of the sincerity of her speech and the seriousness of the situation, he believed her and agreed to take part. The first and most important condition the woman set was to order the military to be stationed at the tavern tables so that they could effectively detain and capture potential criminals threatening the peace of the residents and the security of the settlement as a whole. The second condition was a strict order to gather all citizens in the city's main square to convey important information to everyone, and to rally the people to defend themselves against the impending danger, demonstrating strength and unity in difficult times. And finally, after voicing the first two conditions, the woman hesitated for a moment, looking with anxiety and distrust at her companion, as if sensing that even more difficult trials and decisions lay ahead of them, which would require courage and faith in each other. The boy calmly answered all the questions, explaining that the mercenaries usually gathered in an old, abandoned bar near the fortress walls. And at that moment, determination lit up Fiona's eyes, and she quietly spoke about the third condition. No one in that bar was allowed to hear anything. The girl suddenly and abruptly turned away, refusing to look him in the eye or answer anything, because she didn't want to reveal to the guy all her secrets, old wounds and carefully hidden secrets that she had kept deep inside for many years, not trusting anyone. When the preparations were finally completed, the young couple walked away slowly and carefully. Fiona seemed tired, as if her strength was gradually leaving her, but in her eyes there still burned the fire of determination and confidence that serious trials and fateful events awaited them ahead. Sigrin, however, could not calm down and anxiously repeated himself, persistently asking what exact task the Duke had given Fiona, since anxiety about the fate of the mission and his own future did not leave him, making his heart beat faster and filling his mind with doubts and worries. The lady was in no hurry to reveal all her cards, explaining that the young man was only 14 years old, and it was still too early for him to know all the details and nuances of that dangerous mission, so as not to burden him with unnecessary information that he was not yet ready to accept. However, as they moved forward along the narrow street, Fiona suddenly stopped for a few moments, quietly saying that they were ordered to find mercenaries and eliminate those who were interfering with their plans in order to permanently remove the threat from their lives and maintain peace. After these words, the girl froze in surprise, noticing that Sigrin wanted to go with her, but this was not part of her carefully thought-out plan, causing her inner turmoil and slight anxiety, which she tried to hide behind a calm expression. Noticing her nervousness and doubts, the guy became slightly confused and felt that perhaps his presence here was unwelcome, which made Fiona hesitate, not knowing how to properly explain the situation and maintain a delicate balance of trust and caution between them. Fiona was firmly convinced that this gloomy and unattractive appearance could be too harsh and heavy for children's eyes, especially boys, whose nervous system was too vulnerable, and she herself remembered that once upon a time she too had been a mercenary and had seen a lot. After her gaze met Sigrin's, he said with quiet confidence that he was in fact talented and skilled in combat, despite all the external difficulties and the stern appearance that he radiated, like a strong steel blade tempered in fire. The virgin agreed to believe him without hesitation, although inside she still doubted, but she understood that this time his determination was sincere, and even despite her doubts, it was clear to her that he was truly ready to go with her into the most dangerous battle, despite any risks. Throwing up her hands with a feeling of helplessness and slight confusion, she didn't see any point in it because the guy radiated confidence and fortitude, and despite everything, it seemed that he was the one who could withstand any trials, even if the whole world fell upon them. He hesitated, slightly waving his hand behind his head, and confidently said that he was ready to become an impenetrable shield and reliable protection for her in any circumstances, ready to take any blow and protect her from all the hardships and dangers that could threaten her. After these words, he boldly stepped forward, placing himself in front of her like a living wall, completely ready to protect and shield her from the whole world. And the girl, looking after him in surprise, saw the determination and depth of his feelings, which were reflected in his every movement. His ears turned crimson with slight embarrassment and excitement, betraying sincere emotions that could not be hidden behind a calm appearance, because his heart demanded recognition, and even the steeliest armor of the soul could not contain this blazing fire of feelings inside. With a smile that lit up her face, the beautiful girl ran after the boy, happy that their relationship had gradually become warmer and more sincere, and he seemed to care more about her, showing his attention and tenderness even in small things that had previously seemed unnoticeable. While adults and others were busy with their household chores and daily routines, their little world was filled with new feelings and promises that created an atmosphere of warmth and hope for a happy future together. The townspeople gradually began to realize that the Duke's confidants were, in fact, only children, and this realization caused alarm and mistrust among them, since the responsibility for the fate of the entire principality lay on the shoulders of two young and inexperienced souls. Soon, malicious rumors and gossip began to spread around the young couple, some claiming that these young heroes could be swindlers who wanted to deceive and exploit the Duke's trust for their own selfish purposes, which created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. The Duke considered for a long time whether to send someone experienced and capable of handling the task professionally on this important mission, but ultimately decided against it, believing that it would look foolish and inappropriate in the face of circumstances that required an unusual approach. Scattered papers lay on the floor like forgotten memories, with an important task written on them that needed to be completed, and it was this task that would become the key to further developments and the revelation of the true intentions of all participants. As Fiona walked through the corridors of the palace, she thought about what harsh punishment would be devised for the mercenaries if they were found guilty, and in her thoughts there grew a determination to defend the Duke's honour and restore justice at any cost. For example, a harsh fate could await her, to be chained in a dark and damp prison, where cold and darkness became constant companions and time dragged slowly in anticipation of retribution, depriving her of any hope of salvation and freedom forever. She sternly warned that if anyone dared to disobey her and decide to go against her, they would inevitably be caught, put in chains and cruelly tortured, breaking their bodies and souls, showing by her example the price of disobedience and rebellion against her authority. Sigrin watched thoughtfully, with a look of concern, as the maiden sank deep into her own dark thoughts about how to punish the murderers in this harsh and merciless region, where justice was harsh and punishments were merciless and final. He was greatly frightened and genuinely shocked by her terrible and frightening thoughts of cutting off the limbs of others, an idea full of terrible determination and cold-bloodedness that made his heart beat faster with fear and horror at her cold calculation. The sun shone brightly and warmly over the small village, illuminating the ancient houses and winding streets with its soft, warm, and gentle light, which made everything around seem alive, filled with hope and heralding long-awaited changes. There was also a clear idea to drive the mercenaries beyond the strong walls of the region, where wild and dangerous spirits, powerful and ferocious monsters, lived, capable of mercilessly and easily devouring any uninvited and inexperienced guest who dared to come too close. Suddenly, Sigrun firmly told Fiona that they had finally arrived at the right place, where they had been striving for so long, and many people had already gathered there, mainly representatives of the authorities, who were of great importance for further events and the fate of the entire vast region. People looked at them with surprise and wariness, not believing that in front of them were actually living people, the dukes and their entourage, because their youth, inexperience, and youthful appearance did not at all correspond to the usual expectations and ideas about such high and serious power. Sigrun said in a sullen, abrupt, and rude tone that the men had moved out of the way and were no longer interfering with them, clearly showing irritation, fatigue, and a desire to quickly end the meeting to avoid any further problems, misunderstandings, or unnecessary stress on this important mission. But then Fiona gently but firmly and decisively pulled him aside and politely asked him to step aside, explaining the need to behave carefully and with restraint so as not to cause unnecessary tension, misunderstandings, and maintain a peaceful atmosphere among all those present. In the end, the people finally allowed them to enter and pass through unhindered, and the girl, with a sincere smile and a warm, kind voice, thanked everyone for this trust and sincere support, expressing her deep appreciation and hope for the successful continuation of their common cause. But one of the girls from the town screamed loudly and insistently, sharply demanding that they stop immediately, because her voice sounded with such strength, determination, and conviction that no one could help but pay attention to her and think seriously about her words. It was a girl with bright green eyes and long brown hair, beautiful like a mysterious sorceress from ancient legends, with shimmering hair, who joyfully said that they had finally arrived, causing mixed feelings of excitement among those present. The boy, dissatisfied and rather rude, asked what the hell was going on around him, but Fiona quickly and calmly reassured him that everything was under control and order would be maintained, despite the commotion that had arisen and the unexpected intervention of the stranger and her loud words. The maiden knelt before everyone and with a pleading voice and tears asked for help, begging to save them and protect them from the cruel and merciless mercenaries who threatened them and could destroy everything that they had strived for so long and fought desperately for. But such a bold and self-confident girl could not just stand aside and calmly watch as a small and fragile girl named Fiona boldly and decisively walked forward to defeat a whole crowd of dangerous and ruthless mercenaries, causing real horror. When asked her name, the girl replied that her name was Charlotte, and gently, tenderly squeezed little Fiona's hand, showing support and friendliness, as if promising that she would not be alone in this dangerous and unpredictable world. Fiona smiled back and hurried forward, heading towards her goal, walking with confidence and ease among those around her who watched her with wonder and respect, and behind her, the calm echo of her determination could still be heard. She continued on her way with her companion, confidently and decisively moving forward, while Charlotte watched them attentively and with care, remaining behind, like a quiet and reliable shadow, ready to support at any moment and stand up for protection. The young couple stopped in surprise when suddenly they heard shouts and loud screams, someone desperately demanding that the others leave him alone and do not come closer, and their hearts sank with anxiety and growing tension. It turned out that they were mercenaries who had been caught by the guards, but they resisted fiercely like wild animals and desperately tried to break free from their grip. Despite the numerical superiority of the soldiers and the strong shackles that restricted their movements, one of the murderers suddenly recognized the young noblewoman's companion and, grinning, started a conversation with him. After all, this boy had previously served them and was an object of ridicule, and now he decided to humiliate him once again, throwing insults with a poisonous grin. The young man stood silently and coolly, listening to the accusations and contemptuous ridicule directed at him, not allowing himself a word of justification and not showing offense, as if he accepted this as an inevitable part of his fate. His hand slowly clenched into a tight fist, and although he tried to remain calm, it trembled treacherously with suppressed emotions, and the maiden wanted to comfort him, calm him down, and support him, but she did not know where to start or how to do it correctly, and then she resolutely walked towards the tied-up mercenary, who had once brutally beaten her friend, and this time she wanted to personally punish him, looking into his eyes and knowing that this act would be an act of justice and inner purification for her. The man, frowning intensely and twisting his face in a grimace of irritation and anger, looked at her as if he was facing his sworn enemy, and his gaze was filled with poisonous malice, restrained hatred and icy contempt, as if he did not want to see her even within the confines of the same world. Fiona calmly, but firmly and confidently, stated that she had come on the direct orders of the Duke and asked the mercenary to immediately stop this useless, senseless, and rude resistance, which only worsened their situation and already disgraced them in front of people. The killer, furious and mocking, shouted loudly that a little thing like her had no right, no power, no authority to order him around, and that he was not going to obey a girl who did not understand war, pain, or a real street fight. Suddenly, striking one of the knights with incredible fury and desperate courage, he broke free from their grip and began to threaten the girl, advancing with confident, threatening determination, as if he hoped to intimidate her and prove to everyone his strength, pride, and rebellious spirit. But suddenly, alarmed cries were heard from other killers, for it was they who had once held back the terrible monsters, stood between the monsters and the people when they attacked the region, risking their own lives and proving that they were capable of actions worthy of respect. The townspeople, watching what was happening with surprise and alarm, began to doubt their previous accusations, because if the mercenaries really did protect them from death then maybe they were not such scoundrels, despite their current rude behavior. A radiant magic suddenly began to appear in the baby's thin and delicate hand. At first it was a faint light, like stardust, but with each passing second it grew brighter and more powerful until it turned into a veritable clot of energy, vibrating with power and danger. And right next to the man's feet, suddenly, with a crackling and deafening roar, blinding lightning flashed, striking with such force that the ground shook under his feet, and only a few centimeters were missing for this deadly discharge to kill him on the spot. The killer, shocked to the depths of his soul, suddenly shuddered with horror and froze in place, because for the first time in his life he felt real animal fear, realizing that at that very moment he could actually die and lose everything in one short and helpless instant. The bound mercenary, seeing this magic, fell to the ground with a scream, trembling with fear and instinctively crawling as far away from the witch girl as possible, not believing that in front of him was a child who possessed such destructive and powerful power. And the girl, as if nothing terrible had happened, with an innocent and kind smile, joyfully ran to him, playfully saying that if he had just listened to her right away, then none of this would have happened, and everything would have been much easier for everyone. Suddenly, as soon as Fiona loudly clapped her hands, the sky seemed to shake, and the next moment a crack was heard in the air. A blinding flash of lightning with a booming sound swept across the sky, marking a new wave of her magic and power. The mercenaries, terrified to the depths of their souls, began to look around, almost losing consciousness from fear and tension, because none of them could even imagine that such a tiny and fragile girl was capable of causing such a powerful and destructive magical blow. Folding her arms across her chest and laughing ominously out loud, almost exactly the same way the cruel Duke had once laughed, the girl calmly told all the mercenaries to remain on their knees, because if anyone dared to stand up, she would incinerate them alive without hesitation. Then several young knights, with a serious and stern look, approached the prisoners and carefully took the important papers with the heraldic seal in their hands, and one of them loudly and confidently confirmed that they had an official order with the Duke's signatures allowing the trial to be held. Loudly, with the same childish joy and genuine determination in her voice, the girl solemnly announced that right now, in front of everyone present, a fair and honest trial would begin for the murderers who had destroyed so many lives and destinies in this region. The boy looked with genuine amazement at his young companion, who suddenly began to behave incredibly seriously and coldly, and in an adult tone began to read out the accusations against the scoundrels sitting at her feet, as if she herself had become a judge and mistress of destinies. The other mages seemed weak in comparison, as they could only use a small portion of their spells. For example, summoning a tiny flame in the palm of their hand, which only flickered pitifully and caused laughter in those who saw real magic similar to her power. Looking at her from behind, Sigrun began to gradually understand why the Duke always kept the girl close to him and why he protected her so carefully. Because now it became clear, she was not just a child, but part of an important and hidden goal, carefully planned. The fact that Fiona was still a very young girl and yet possessed such destructive power made a strong impression even on adults, and people began to whisper, discussing not only her abilities, but also the Duke himself, who became the subject of rumors. That's why the Duke constantly pampered the little girl in the palace. He brought her sweets, gave her beautiful books, surrounded her with care and teachers, striving to make her not just strong, but also smart, because in the future she was supposed to accomplish something special. The aristocrat clearly wanted something from Fiona in exchange for her care, and although he never said it directly, everything indicated that he was the kind of person who valued profit above feelings and was willing to use someone else's power for his own purposes. And now he looked at her from the crowd with anxiety and apprehension, afraid that she might tell about such a simple man like him as soon as they returned to the castle, because it could harm his position, safety, and even his life in the future. Pointing confidently with her fingers, the girl firmly said that the mercenaries had only two options. Either they left the castle grounds and went beyond its walls, where wild and ferocious monsters awaited, or they would have to face much harsher and more merciless consequences. The first option she offered them was that the mercenaries could have the chance to leave the castle grounds and go outside its walls to live there among the wild and dangerous monsters, living in constant fear and under the threat of attack, risking their lives daily. After this, she paused for a moment, as if choosing her words, and then announced that there was a second, far more terrible option in which she would have to take harsh measures, causing everyone present to shudder with fearful anticipation. She then pointed her finger at the man's groin, hinting at something terrible and merciless, making everyone understand that her words meant a personal and painful punishment that could forever change the life of the negligent mercenary and instill fear in others. And then, with a gloomy but innocent smile, the girl said that she would cut off that very part of his body, while it seemed that she was talking about something sweet and innocent, as if playing with the imagination and frightening at the same time with her cold calm. All the men standing nearby and watching the trial suddenly recoiled in unexpected horror. Even Sigrun, who was accustomed to cruelty, could not hide his shock and confusion at what was happening, which increased the tension in the air. Her hands clenched tightly, and gritting her teeth, she declared with determination that she could have shown at least a drop of mercy to them before, but now that would no longer happen, for the time for pity had long passed, and the time for just retribution had come. The mercenary, overcome with rage, clenched his teeth in anger and measured her with a look full of hatred and contempt, as if trying to suppress this anger within himself, but unable to contain the raging emotions that were tearing him apart from the inside. The townspeople recoiled, outraged by the mercenary's insolence, and Fiona, ignoring their reaction, clearly and loudly declared that the Northerners were nothing but scum and would never be real people, deprived of any protection and support after they had brought punishment upon themselves. Jewels, glittering coins, and untold riches rained down from above like golden rain, sparkling brightly in the sun and beckoning everyone around with their dazzling brilliance, promising untold treasures and great power to those who could obtain them and keep them in their hands. All Northerners greedily desired to acquire as much wealth and priceless precious treasures as possible, because this was their main job: to obtain, collect, and increase property, turning every coin into a means of achieving power, influence, and prosperity. The assassins and the dukes shook hands tightly, for their mutual benefit was closely linked. The assassins did the dirty work, and the dukes protected the city from mercenaries, receiving in return generous payments, influence, and an expansion of their position and control over the region. Suddenly, a woman's footsteps were heard on the soft green grass, the sound of which echoed in the quiet silence, attracting the attention of those around her, and foreshadowing an important event that would soon change the course of events, the lives and destinies of many people. The man broke the long silence, demanding that they untie him immediately if they couldn't decide what to do with him. His voice sounded stern, decisive, and confident, as if he wanted not just freedom, but complete control over his destiny, and threatened those who dared to detain him. The girl had long since sighed with weariness and anxiety in her soul, because she was beginning to be tense by the strange, oppressive, and prolonged silence from the crowd, which seemed frightening to her and indicated that something was clearly wrong here. Suddenly, guards appeared in black robes and with shining swords in their hands, dressed in strict uniforms, which immediately caused tension among those present, because everyone understood that this meant the approach of serious and decisive events for which no one was prepared. A hand, clad in a dark glove, slowly rose and, like an invisible shadow, began to gradually approach the magician's side, causing tension and anxiety in the air, as if foreshadowing an imminent important event that would change the course of events forever. It was the Duke himself, suddenly appearing at the very back of the little girl, whose gaze was full of determination, and he sternly but carefully asked her what decision she had made regarding the punishment of the murderers, waiting for the answer with importance and impatience in his voice. It was Abel Halen himself, a handsome, graceful nobleman with white hair and cold, penetrating eyes, whose gaze revealed both power and a hidden softness that made his figure both irresistible and awe-inspiring. With a naive smile of fear, Fiona asked in surprise what exactly brought him here, because he was holding an important document in his hands, and she could hardly understand how such a tall man ended up in such an unexpected place, showing rare humanity. The man spoke quietly and coldly from behind, saying that he had no need to explain the reason why he was inspecting his territory, because his power was absolute, and no one dared to question his actions and decisions. Suddenly, Fiona felt herself being lifted into the air by the strong and powerful arms of an aristocrat, and she noticed with a surprised gasp how unexpectedly and quickly this happened, as if fate itself had drawn her into a new and unpredictable game. Having introduced herself, the girl confidently answered the aristocrat that she knew of only 2 options that could be offered to the mercenaries, and her voice sounded decisive, as if she had long ago thought over each of the possible outcomes and was ready to make any decision. It turned out that Abel Halen had heard the harsh words of the mercenaries, who shamelessly called all northerners savage and uncivilized, and it was because of this insult that he had come here to take cruel revenge on them and show them who was the real master in this area. After this, the grim man stepped towards one of the murderers and said with cold cruelty that mercy had never been shown to the likes of them, for showing compassion to murderers and traitors was useless and only weakened the government. The boy, lying on the ground, convulsed in fear as the Duke himself approached him menacingly, radiating a strength and ruthlessness that left no chance for mercy or salvation, and the boy's heart pounded wildly in his chest. Without thinking twice, Abel Halen slammed his sharp heel down hard on the young man's groin, causing him to let out a wild cry of pain that echoed throughout the square, causing those around him to shudder and feel the Duke's terrible power. Cruelly and without the slightest regret, the aristocrat said that such people had no right to be on his territory and pretend that they could rule here, after which he began to trample on the wounded body, emphasizing his absolute superiority and strength. Looking at the terrible and inhumane actions of a cruel and merciless man, Fiona shuddered with the deepest fear, realizing that at times she herself could be very cruel and merciless, and this thought made her heart squeeze with internal contradiction and excruciating anxiety. After which, having finally removed his leg from the body of the captive youth, Abel Halen loudly and decisively declared that let the 2 terrible punishments be carried out simultaneously, so that everyone would understand the full seriousness and inevitability of the grave consequences for their actions and betrayals. The guards, hearing the Duke's stern order, loudly declared that they would immediately carry out this order without the slightest delay, and hurried to the bound murderers, ready without any doubt to carry out everything, leaving no chance for mercy or salvation. Holding the baby in his strong arms, Abel Halen sternly and confidently whispered to her that there was no need to worry about such trifles and quarrels anymore, because next time he would watch everyone personally and do what was necessary to maintain order and strict discipline. Suddenly, Fiona frowned and thought deeply about why the Duke, along with his powerful magicians and rough soldiers, had made such a long and difficult journey just for her, and why it was her fate that was intertwined with his powerful will and grandiose plans. The trees stood bare and lifeless, their branches covered in a light layer of fresh snow, which fell softly and quietly on them, creating a winter fairy tale, as if nature had frozen in anticipation of something important and magical, filling the air with coolness and tranquility. Geron helped her make a large snowman out of snow, smiling a kind and sincere smile, and proudly said that the gentleman had recently left for the city specifically for Fiona, to provide her with a better future, despite all the difficulties and obstacles along the way. The girl raised her eyebrows in surprise, clearly not believing at first that the nobleman had actually come here for her, considering that she was covered in snow and looked completely confused and unapproachable, like that very winter that did not want to let go of the cold. Her friend, who was also actively participating in making the snowman, loudly declared that he would rather believe in the imminent end of the world than in this incredible and amazing truth, but his voice still sounded like genuine hope and a desire to believe in a miracle. While the boy carefully leveled the layer of snow, making it even and smooth, the knight, with a heavy sigh, admitted that his master truly had a harsh and nasty character, which sometimes frightened even the most steadfast and courageous people around him. Fiona froze in surprise when she learned the truth, that the aristocrat actually thought of her differently. He assumed that she would not be able to complete the task, but still ordered his people to support her and help her overcome the difficulties, despite his doubts. After this, the man sat down next to the girl and with a slight smile said that she should be more confident in herself, because it is inner strength and faith in one's own abilities that can lead to success even where everything seems hopeless and difficult. He then added mysteriously that he wasn't entirely sure what his master was thinking, but that Fiona would soon be the first to discover the truth behind those thoughts, and that could change her life dramatically, opening up new possibilities. Raising his hand, Jeren loudly announced that he was going to get a parcel of warm drinks to warm himself up, and promised to return soon, leaving Fiona alone with her thoughts and inner doubts, which now seemed a little less heavy. Young Fiona waved back, realizing that the guy looked strangely agitated and tense, as if he was hiding some important secret, and this further increased her curiosity and desire to understand all the mysteries. The noblewoman decided not to dwell on this difficult issue any longer and not to think about it for long, preferring to switch her attention to something brighter and more joyful, so as not to darken her mood and maintain her peace of mind in this difficult moment. So she smiled and waved to her friend, gently asking him if he would like to play with her and help her join the snowman's head to the body to make their creation complete and beautiful, creating an atmosphere of joy and childish carelessness. Sigrun smiled slightly and readily agreed, carefully picking up the snow head and placing it on the body, doing so with care and respect, as if touching something fragile and important to create a beautiful and perfect snowman. Fiona, her expression focused, began carefully sculpting and joining the snow seams, trying to make them as smooth and unnoticeable as possible, so that the entire snowman would look like a single whole, a true work of art from a winter fairy tale. The young man, a little embarrassed, watched her neat and gentle movements, feeling that she looked very sweet and especially charming, like a sincere child who found joy and peace in this simple matter. Suddenly, gathering his strength and overcoming his shyness, he quietly took a step forward towards her, smiling softly and with genuine interest, asked what she planned to do next with this snowman, how she intended to continue creating a real miracle from snow and ice causing admiration. Fiona missed some of the boy's words because he spoke very quietly and indistinctly, and he continued to mumble something incoherent about a simple visit, as if he was afraid to say something important directly and openly, leaving her in a state of slight bewilderment and thoughtfulness. With a smile, she carefully asked him where exactly she should come next, hoping to understand where they were waiting for her and could tell her more so that she could prepare and not find herself in an awkward position or an unexpected situation. Pointing at himself and blushing slightly, the boy quietly asked if she would come to him so that they could meet and spend time together, and his shyness and embarrassment made this moment especially touching and sincere, causing warmth in the girl's soul. The boy fell silent when she didn't respond, feeling awkward and embarrassed, as if he was afraid he had done something wrong, and now he waited impatiently for her reaction, hoping for a positive answer but not daring to wait long. When the girl addressed him by name, sweet Sigrun turned away and covered his face with his hand, quietly saying that he shouldn't have spoken about his feelings and that it was better to forget everything, trying to hide his vulnerability and embarrassment behind a mask of coldness and alienation. He lowered his head and muttered sadly that for her he was nothing more than just a reason to care, a man whom she pitied but did not truly love, and this admission sounded like a bitter truth from which she wanted to run and hide. The girl gently and affectionately hugged him with her arms, placing her palms on his shoulders and quietly asking him not to say such nonsense, because she believed that inside he was much more than just an object of pity and deserved true friendship and great warmth. After this, Fiona kindly and gently said that she would definitely come to him and visit him as often as possible, because it was very important for her to maintain a strong connection and give each other warmth, attention, and care, despite all the difficulties and distances that may arise between them. Sigrun blushed deeply from the unexpected tenderness and inner warmth, and she, noticing this, gently took his hands, holding them carefully and quietly, as if trying to show that she would always be there, supporting, protecting, and not letting him go, even in the most difficult and challenging moments of life. The snowball was already fully formed, becoming an important and significant part of the snowman, which gradually took on form, life, and soul in their hands, symbolizing the beginning of a new friendship, bright hope, and tender, warm feelings, despite the cold and winter frost around them. She cleaned up neatly. Fiona warmly and sincerely promised that she would come to him as often as possible, despite any obstacles and circumstances, because they were true friends, and it was very important for her to maintain this strong and trusting bond between them forever. Sigrun stood frozen in surprise, his mouth open, not immediately understanding how it was that she spoke to him so kindly, warmly and sincerely, as if revealing a part of her soul to him, and this evoked in him unexpected and deep feelings that he could not immediately comprehend. A deep, drawn-out, awkward silence fell between the couple as they stood opposite each other, as if time had slowed down, and the softly falling snow enveloped them in its quiet, almost magical shroud, creating an atmosphere of thoughtfulness and slight sadness around them. Fiona didn't understand why Sigrun didn't answer her right away, because she had made a sincere promise to visit him, support him, and be there, and now her embarrassment from his silence made her even more confused, lonely, and thoughtful, as if she was lost in her thoughts and feelings. Therefore, the noblewoman decided to count sheep in her head to distract herself and calm her nerves so that she would not feel so awkward, anxious, and embarrassed, while she waited for an answer and tried to understand what was really going on between them and how to act correctly in this difficult situation. Finally, Sigrun spoke quietly but confidently, saying that he would now look forward to her visits and that she should definitely keep this promise, because it would significantly strengthen their bond and help both maintain hope for the best, despite all the trials and difficulties ahead. Their feet almost touched each other, standing firmly in the cold snow, which crunched quietly under them, as if testifying to the fact that an invisible thread of trust and understanding had already formed between them, connecting two souls in this harsh and cold winter world. After that, he carefully came closer, took her hands in his strong palms, and promised to work hard and strive for success, so that one day, when he was worthy and strong, he could come to her without fear and proudly show what he had achieved. This meant that the boy was ready to climb the difficult and long ladder of his position in the Duke's territory step by step, realizing that many trials, overcoming many steps, and difficult life decisions lay ahead of him. However, he was very embarrassed and understood that she probably did not believe in his strength and abilities, because he was just an orphan, without support and connections, and this thought sometimes lay heavily on his heart, forcing him to doubt his own capabilities. But Fiona interrupted his words confidently and warmly, declaring that she truly believed in him with all her heart, and that he would definitely be able to achieve great things, exceed all expectations, and become a man who would change his destiny and leave a mark on history. The boy dreamed of a bright and happy future, full of great wealth, strength, and power, so that he could one day rule his own empire, where his name would be revered and admired, and his achievements would be a source of pride and inspiration. And soon he hoped to put a ring on the finger of his beloved, have a wedding full of happiness and love, and begin a new chapter of his life filled with joy, mutual respect, and bright hopes for a future together. Then Fiona, with a light and sincere smile, promised that she would always be there and help him achieve everything he dreamed of, support him in difficult times, and help him get back on his feet so that he could confidently walk his path to success and happiness. She made a firm and unwavering promise to herself when she saw the visible scars on his chest, a reminder of the trials he had endured, and with a deep sense of compassion and determination, she was determined to help him cope with the past and build a bright future. At this time, Geron, returning with 2 cups of warm aromatic drinks, carefully held them with both hands, from which steam rose, and with a soft smile on his face, approached them, wanting to warm and lift their spirits on this cold winter day. On that cold and frosty day, they finally managed to build 2 snowmen, one large and majestic, like a guardian of the winter forest, and the second small and funny, which seemed to reflect all the lightness and joy of childhood, filling their hearts with warmth and smiles. Many long days and countless nights passed. The sun repeatedly set behind the distant horizon and rose again above the earth, illuminating the icy fields, while time imperceptibly slipped through the fingers, bringing with it changes, scars, and inevitable trials. 5 years later, in the silence of a snowy and icy dawn, the snow began to fall again, and a flag bearing the image of a wild wolf, a symbol of loyalty, fortitude, strength of spirit, and tenacity, fluttered high above the plain, raised as a sign of victory and an unconquered spirit. The bodies of the fallen monsters burned with a bright, cleansing flame, crunching in the fire that was reflected in the snow, creating the illusion that the earth itself was crying, with pain and bitterness, remembering the suffering and cries of those who fell in battle, not waiting for dawn. The young girl, her snow-white hair flowing freely in the biting wind, used all her magic to finally destroy the remains of the monsters, leaving no trace, not a shadow of the threat that had tormented these lands for so long and mercilessly. This was a mature and stronger Fiona, who had been through fire, cold, betrayal, and pain, trembling not from fear but from the icy wind, leading a close-knit squad, her own personal squad of fighters, ready to go with her to the ends of the earth. Fiona had long since matured and had noticeably changed. Her features had become nobler, her movements confident, and her red eyes, sparkling under the snowy sky, combined with her frost-coloured hair, and at 18 she looked not only beautiful, but also inspiring respect. One of the warriors, a young man in dark armour, noticed how she mechanically rubbed her shoulder from the cold, and with a worried expression on his face, advised her not to let down her guard, because danger could arise at any moment, especially in such silence. He raised his voice loudly and got her attention, asking what she intended to do if the monsters suddenly appeared again and attacked unexpectedly, since the snow and ash lying everywhere did not guarantee that the enemy had been destroyed completely and forever. Fiona quickly realized that the man standing in front of her was a young man, still quite new to the squad. I think his name was Alan, and he had only recently taken part in the war, so his voice sounded both anxious and trying to seem brave. With a slight grin and a wave of her hand, the lady waved to the side where a spark of her magic had just flared up, and calmly but confidently replied that she was focused enough not to miss a single movement, not a single shadow on the battlefield. Fiona's magic, sparkling with a bright white-blue light, pierced the body of the huge monster in a straight line, and it immediately, without making a single sound, collapsed dead as soon as the magical charge penetrated its flesh and destroyed all life inside, leaving only ash and steam. The warrior standing next to her recoiled with obvious horror and fear in his eyes, amazed at how easily and swiftly the young sorceress had slain the mighty monster, and his gaze was a mixture of surprise, confusion, and almost superstitious fear of her power. Covering his mouth with his hand in sudden shock, He stumbled and fell backwards into the soft snow, his eyes wide and unable to look away from what remained in the place of the fallen monster. Only steam, charred flesh, and black wisps of smoke. Clapping her hands in front of her and turning to face the fighters with a hint of determination, Fiona calmly but firmly asked the guards not to worry about her safety, but rather to focus on the field and carefully monitor the situation so as not to miss a threat. As a result, Alan, having barely risen from the ground and felt the snow under his feet, continued to tremble in fear, and although he tried to remain steadfast, it was clear how much he remained a timid youth who found it difficult to contain his emotions and fear. Realizing that the frightened boy needed to be calmed as quickly as possible, the lady slowly approached and placed her warm, excited hand on his shoulder, trying to convey through her touch a feeling of calm, care, and inner balance. After that, she pressed herself a little closer to him, smiled warmly and quietly, said that she would always be there for them, that he should not worry. She would not leave them alone, and if necessary, she would protect him until the very end, no matter what the threat. Her words and tender closeness made the guy's heart flutter, and his ears immediately flushed red. He was embarrassed, but also touched, because no one had ever shown him such sincere concern before. And it was at that moment that he truly fell in love with her for the first time. And suddenly, as if breaking the silence, a dead monster fell right in front of them with a dull sound. Its huge mouth was wide open, and blood was dripping from its fangs, scorching the snow with hot drops, as if proving that danger was still nearby. The man jumped back in fear, leaping sharply towards the nearest tree, barely keeping his balance, and stared in horror at the monster's head, which, having separated from the body, rolled down the slope, leaving a dark, bloody trail on the white snow. The girl looked up in frustration, covering her face with her hand, and sighed heavily, because her best friend had once again ruined all her efforts and attempts to calm the others down, introducing tension, noise, and unnecessary harshness into the situation. Before them, in a grim, stern black uniform that emphasized his strength and cold determination, stood another knight, a man with massive gloves and a drawn sword, ready at any moment to strike and protect his allies. It was a long-grown Sigrin who had already managed to defeat many terrible monsters, shed much blood, and lose many comrades. He sternly told his friend not to hesitate and to step aside, away from danger. While they spoke, the heavily armored guards fought the monsters, clanging their swords and clashing in powerful blows, and although the battle was fierce and filled with screams, it was the warriors who were victorious and gathered the bodies of the slain monsters into one pile. Sigrin, having matured, hardened, and grown considerably stronger over these long years, had become a true beauty with hair as black as a raven's wing, cunning eyes the colour of polished steel, and pale snow-white skin on which time seemed to have left no trace. Lady Fiona insistently and with a serious, almost royal air, demanded that her friend apologize to the poor god, whom he had literally scared to death with his abrupt appearance, icy tone, and dismissive behavior in a tense situation. Putting his hand behind his head, the man lazily, irritably, and rather rudely replied that he didn't consider it his personal problem at all, because, in his opinion, if a soldier trembled at the sight of blood, it meant he simply wasn't ready for a truly terrible war. After these cold words, Sigrin decisively, demonstratively, and almost defiantly drew a semicircle around himself with his sword, plunging the blade into the frozen ground, causing it to vibrate. And with this he made it clear to everyone that he was not going to explain anything to anyone. With a wild and evil grin on his face, he whispered quietly but confidently that this was only the most terrible and brutal start of their long and bloody battle, which was just beginning and would take many lives if they were not careful and collected. The warriors, their heads bowed in horror and the realization of the hopelessness of the situation, realized that they had fallen into a carefully prepared trap, and quietly, stealthily, they began to retreat, carrying lighted torches, lighting their way in the darkness, trying to avoid inevitable death. Confused and a little irritated, Fiona gently but firmly pushed the guy aside, sternly telling him to stand quietly to the side, watch carefully, and learn how to behave correctly in battle, without interfering with more experienced warriors. With a slight smile and a kind intonation, Fiona began to inspire and motivate the other warriors, who were also new and still unsure of themselves. But thanks to her support and words, they soon began to do much better, and their fear gradually receded. Suddenly, one of the soldiers, raising his hand a little embarrassedly, dared to ask because he had heard rumors that a special guard would soon be chosen who would personally protect Lady Fiona from all threats and attacks, which aroused his genuine interest and concern. With a broad smile and genuine enthusiasm, the girl cheerfully replied that this was indeed the case. She was indeed looking for a reliable and brave guard, as it was difficult for one person to cope with the dangers that lay in wait for her every day. From such an unexpected and bold confession, the guard immediately flushed deeply, turned red from his ears to his neck, looked down at the ground, and no longer knew what to do with himself, because he did not expect that his modest question would receive such a direct and personal response. Sigrin, standing to the side, irritably clenched his teeth in anger and rage, holding back the desire to say everything he thought, because his girlfriend's behavior caused a storm of emotions in him. He could not get used to the idea that someone else could guard her. Fiona was surprised to notice her old friend's angry and burning gaze, not understanding what exactly had caused such a reaction, as if jealousy had suddenly flared up in his chest, which he could not hide, even pretending to be indifferent. 5 whole years had passed since the small and naive girl first crossed the threshold of the duchy, settling in the cold fortress that soon became her home. And now she was forced to realize who she had truly become. The girl Fiona had already turned 18 years old, and her friend Sigrin had turned 19 years old, and now they had both officially reached adulthood, which made them recognized adults, capable of making important decisions and taking responsibility for them. Sigrin has grown considerably over the years, becoming stronger and more battle-hardened, and most importantly, he has kept his long-standing promise to Fiona, made when they were children. He studied hard under the Duke, became a master of the blade, and earned the respect of even the harshest mentors. Now, none of the older and more experienced knights dared to look down on him, because the one who had previously been just a lady's friend had become a strong, influential, and dangerous nobleman, commanding respect even among the elders and advisors at court. Fiona herself, having demonstrated rare bravery, extraordinary magic, and loyalty in defending the city from monsters, received a large reward, thanks to which she could now live calmly, confidently, and independently, without fear of returning to poverty or loneliness. When her close friend Sigrin left for a short time on business, leaving her alone with her thoughts, Fiona decided that it was the perfect time to relax a little, plan a short vacation, and get at least a little distraction from the constant hustle and bustle and battles. However, before the trip, an unexpected problem arose. Duke Abel Halen himself, a man who could not be ignored, approached her personally and calmly but persistently asked whether she had seriously considered his previous important proposal. Fiona sat silently opposite the Duke, looking down and frowning slightly, and thoughtfully replied that she was still in the process of making a decision and could not give him a final answer because she was not sure that such a step was the right one. Then Abel Halen, without losing his calm and restraint, offered her something unexpected: to become his daughter according to documents, to call him father, and to accept all the privileges that would be due to the legitimate heir of the ducal family. The girl felt awkward and internally embarrassed, because such an idea seemed too personal, almost alien to her, and she sharply but firmly replied that she did not want to be anyone's adopted daughter, even if it was such a respected person as he. The Duke, looking intently and almost paternally, restrainedly but persistently, asked her to at least seriously consider his unexpected proposal and not rush to a categorical refusal, because such an opportunity was given to only a few and could completely change her future. With a cold, honed inner confidence and icy calm, Lady Fiona firmly replied that she was absolutely indifferent to any titles, ranks, luxury, or power that she could acquire by becoming part of someone else's family and losing her freedom. With a soft half smile and a slight squint, Abel Halen told her that she could have so much more, everything she wanted, even things she was still afraid to dream about, if she would simply agree to accept his offer and become part of his home. The girl replied with cold directness that she was physically and mentally uncomfortable with the very idea of Abel Halen becoming her relative, to which the man, barely containing his emotions, called her rude, although there was a quiet resentment in his voice. With his hands folded in his lap and his gaze fixed on the floor, the nobleman calmly declared that he understood everything, and thanked her for the faithful and honest service she had faithfully rendered to him over the course of 5 long and difficult years, asking for nothing in return. Puzzled and worried, Lady Fiona asked why he had suddenly spoken so doomedly and seriously, as if saying goodbye. After all, it all sounded like some kind of veiled confession, and she was afraid that the man might be seriously ill. Behind her, the door hinges clicked quietly, and a cold wind suddenly rushed through the glass doors, shining with the reflection of the window, as if emphasizing the anxious and tense atmosphere that hung in the room between them after this strange conversation. Suddenly, the aristocrat crossed his arms in front of him, looked at Fiona intently and calmly, said that the situation on his territory had now become completely stable, and if she really wanted to leave, he would no longer hold her by force. After a short, tense pause, the man added in a restrained voice with a hint of sadness in his voice that even if she decided to leave for the capital, where she might be humiliated for her origins and bastard status, he would still protect her with all his might. Fiona hesitated slightly, clasped her trembling fingers, and looking down, quietly began by saying that she was sincerely grateful for his generous offer and attention, but admitted that there was something personal in her heart that prevented her from making this decision without much thought. The aristocrat, looking at her without anger, calmly said that she had already repaid him in full for everything he had done for her, and that now, finally, she was free of any obligations to him. She no longer owed anything, and he did not hold a grudge against her. Struck by the Duke's unexpected kindness and nobility, the girl froze in silence, and only when he quietly added that he had previously paid her for her work and devotion, but now wanted to help only at the behest of his heart, did she feel a poignant gratitude. After a short pause, almost without looking at her, the man slowly raised his hand, ran his fingers along the edge of the table, and then suddenly handed Lady Fiona an envelope, a sealed letter with an embossed seal, which exuded seriousness and mystery. The girl was deeply surprised and very confused when she suddenly realized that she had unexpectedly found herself holding a letter from the Green family, the very same ones with whom she had not spoken for a long time, and for whom she did not feel the slightest longing or pain, although she had not received any news from them for a very long time. Soon, her own older brother suddenly appeared, took her aside, and, without the slightest pity, confronted her with the fact that they were now sending her to a real war, and she must leave everything familiar that she knew in order to accept the difficult and dangerous fate of endless battles. She tried to loudly object, begged and pleaded to be left at home, explaining that she was categorically not ready for such trials, and especially not for bloodshed. But her words were completely ignored, and her desires and fears turned out to be insignificant against the backdrop of the decisive will of the family and the ruthless authorities. Fiona wondered with alarm and confusion why, after long and painful years of silence, they had suddenly sent her this letter. She had never received any news from them before, and now this became an unexpected and alarming signal, forcing her to reconsider her views and plans. Abel Halen, carefully observing her reaction, was hiding a deep secret within himself. He himself did not yet know what exactly Fiona was going to offer next, but a new and important proposal was already maturing in his soul, one that could radically change the fate of not only her, but also the entire vast duchy. And after a short pause, with a strong but evil, barely restrained smile, he calmly and coldly said that, if necessary, he could completely destroy the house of the family that had so mercilessly and cruelly sent her here, without thinking about the consequences. The little girl began to cry and, with a trembling voice, told the Duke that she had not expected such cruelty and injustice, because she believed in goodness, but now she felt only cold and pain from his decisive and harsh actions, which seemed merciless to her. The maiden held an envelope containing an important letter in her hands, and she hesitated for a long time whether to open it and read it, because an inner premonition told her that this letter might contain a fateful decision that would change her life forever. Fiona, looking closely at the neat letterhead, understood that soon the main character of the novel would appear in her story, the one who could change the course of events and bring hope to dark and gloomy days filled with trials. The lady walked away quietly and thoughtfully, deeply aware that the time had come to finally leave this place, leaving the envelope lying quietly on the table, as if it had been patiently waiting for its moment to open and change the fate of its owner forever. The girl responded to the Duke's unexpected proposal to call him father, with a slight, barely noticeable, but cold smile, firmly declaring that no words or conventions would change her true attitude towards him or make this relationship sincere and real. The aristocrat, hearing such an answer, was clearly surprised and a little upset, but he said calmly that she had once been a small and naive girl, but had now grown up, and sighed heavily, realizing that the old times could not be returned. Outside the window, the night was falling quickly. The curtains fluttered in a light breeze, and time inexorably moved forward, taking with it opportunities, leaving only memories and the inevitability of an approaching fate that cannot be changed even by the strongest will. Reading the letter, the lady was in complete shock when she learned the terrible and unexpected news. Her own family officially announced her death, as if she had long ceased to exist for them and was forgotten forever. The letter spoke of a crucial matter of succession that would completely change her complicated life, and it urgently demanded that the lady unconditionally renounce her former rights and titles for the good of the family and the bright future of the entire duchy, which caused her deep inner turmoil. The lady grabbed her head sharply, feeling a sudden sharp pain and heaviness in her temples, as if her whole world had collapsed around her, and her heart sank with bitterness and disappointment, realizing that her fate was now predetermined without taking into account her true desires and feelings. 5 long years ago, her family had cruelly sent her to certain death, without consulting them or even asking her personal opinion, as if she were just a pawn in a big and insidious game, deprived of a voice and her own will, which now made her suffer greatly again. The letter lay heavy and bitter on the table, forgotten and abandoned, like a symbol of her lost hopes and the unspoken words she had never been able to utter at that fateful moment when everything began to rapidly turn against her. Fiona lay heavily on the bed in her room, feeling that thoughts of her inheritance and her family's past were haunting her, because now she was faced with a serious choice on which depended the future and well-being of her dearest family. Her family seemed to be clearly unhappy when they found out that she was still alive, and now, while they continue their bitter struggle for wealth and power, her return could put everything in jeopardy and cause many unpredictable consequences. On the other hand, Fiona understood very well that if she refused to sign her own death certificate and confirm her fictitious absence, the authorities and her relatives would have serious questions that could not be so easily ignored or avoided. Virgo had no intention of causing harm or destruction to anyone, because she understood well that otherwise she would be mercilessly imprisoned, where she would not be well, and she would forever be deprived of freedom and the ability to influence her own destiny. The aristocrat resolutely decided to sign the waiver later, when she had already left for the capital, because only there would she be able to calmly and thoughtfully consider all her options, without succumbing to pressure and fear, and also gain control over her life. Suddenly there was a loud and insistent knock on the door, and a moment later, her close friend entered the room, who without further ado, with anxiety and seriousness on his face, walked straight towards her, forcing Fiona to turn all her attention to the unexpected guest. Without a second's hesitation, Fiona quickly and decisively let the guy into the room, not paying attention to the possible consequences, since she understood that his arrival could be important and require an immediate discussion of important and urgent issues. However, Fiona became very wary and scared when she heard her friend reply that they could not have a conversation in this place because there were too many prying ears, and they should definitely go to a more secluded, safe and private place to talk. Lately, Sigrin had been feeling awkward and a little embarrassed around Fiona, because since they had grown up and much had changed, he had been increasingly thinking about how to properly express his thoughts and feelings. And suddenly he decided to say that he had heard important news from the Duke himself. Suddenly, the lady, not expecting such a turn of events in the conversation, raised her hand to stop the young man, and with cold determination and an authoritative tone, ordered him to call an aristocrat, a respected and wise teacher who could help him sort out the current situation. In a conversation with her boyfriend, Fiona explained in detail that her father was dying, and after that she needed to go to the capital to visit the Green family, which had long remained a mystery to her and a source of anxiety about the future. The young man continued asking questions, wondering if she was planning to return to the Duke's house after her visit to the capital, to which the girl replied that she planned to stay there for a short time, since her true place was outside this environment, and she was looking for a new life and path. The beauty could not clearly and confidently name the exact time of her return to the capital, so she decided to say that she was unlikely to return to the Duke's house, since her heart and thoughts now belonged to a completely different future, full of uncertainty and new challenges. Upon hearing such news, dear Sigrin was deeply upset, as his close friend was about to leave forever, leaving him alone with worries, memories, and the emptiness that began to fill his soul in anticipation of separation. He started shouting loudly at her, demanding to know why she had decided to leave and leave everything behind, to which young Fiona firmly and decisively replied that she would never return here again, because this house was no longer her true place. Coldly and calmly, as if reading his thoughts, she explained that she had no compelling reason left to remain in the Duke's house, where she felt like just a pawn in someone else's game, deprived of freedom and her own choice, and now she wanted to live differently. The guy took several decisive steps forward and, looking deeply into Fiona's eyes, gently but insistently said that they urgently needed to talk and try to sort everything out in order to finally understand each other, because there were too many unresolved issues between them. He placed his hands on her shoulders, squeezing them lightly but firmly, and, looking closely at her face, asked again if she was really going to leave forever, because for him this decision was unexpected and hard to accept, as if it was the end of their entire shared history. The nobleman was deeply angry and irritated with her because she decided to leave so suddenly, abandoning him without warning, and he was angry not only with her, but also with the Duke, who allowed her to leave the house without asking his opinion, as if betraying his trust and feelings. After this, he again cast a stern and cold look at her, full of bitterness and resentment, and reminded her that they had spent 5 long years together. But despite this, she spoke to him so coldly and mercilessly, as if she were leaving him without any feelings or regrets. The young man cursed loudly and harshly, expressing his deep anger and strong disappointment because of the problems that had suddenly arisen between them, and the lady, watching him closely, could not fully understand what exactly their common difficulty was and why everything had changed so abruptly. Surprised and with a hint of sadness, she quietly asked him if he really thought and believed that they would always be together, no matter what, as if this thought was his only support and greatest hope in this complex and unpredictable world. The guy's face became noticeably upset and deeply depressed. He looked at her sadly, trying to find words to somehow explain his feelings, but deep down he understood that their paths were already completely diverging, and nothing could be brought back. She calmly and gently began to explain to him that they had long since grown up, changed, and the time had come to part, so that each could go their own way, finally find their own happiness, and achieve what had previously seemed unattainable and very distant. The noblewoman firmly insisted that he finally turn on logic and stop being guided by emotions, but he responded by saying that his friend was heartless and cold, unable to understand the true feelings and pain that he felt deep down. Icicles sparkled outside the window, and the frosty wind made everything around seem even colder and more lifeless, as if nature itself was reflecting their inner experiences and the cold emptiness that had settled in the heroes' hearts. The lady, smiling through a slight sadness, told him not to make such a gloomy and sad face, because even in the most difficult moments it is worth maintaining hope and faith in the best, because only in this way can one overcome any difficulties and trials. Then, in the distant past, they spoke with hope and faith about how they would always be together, in one place, despite all the difficulties and hardships. But all this seemed like just childish, naive promises that are forgotten over time and dissolve in the whirlpool of life and changes of fate. Many people, envious people and ill-wishers, wished the boy's death, mercilessly pursued him and did not give him a moment of peace, turning his life into a constant desperate struggle for survival, freedom, and the right to a peaceful existence in this harsh and cruel world. And that is precisely why the city's capital became a place for the boy and his faithful friend to flee from as quickly as possible in order to avoid persecution, constant dangers, and the insidious malice that lay in wait for them at literally every step, depriving them of any hope for a peaceful future. The maiden carefully looked at the face of the young, strong man, gently asking him not to be sad, because very soon the story of the book would begin, in which he would become a great and powerful emperor, whose name would be forever inscribed in the golden annals of the great empire. The girl quietly and sincerely said that she would always stand by his side and was ready to do anything for him, to overcome any obstacles and difficulties, because her support and devotion were an unwavering support for him in life. Slightly embarrassed and hesitant, the young man asked her what if he wanted her to stay here next to him forever, to go through all the trials together and never part again, because for him it was very important and dear. The lady smiled, with gentle warmth and a slight sadness in her voice, answering that she would do everything in her power and capabilities, but except one thing: she must leave, because the time had come to part and begin a new important stage in her life, and now there was no turning back. Frustrated, depressed, and a little confused, the man muttered that the lady was so conflicted, as if there was a constant, endless struggle in her heart between the desire to be with him and the need to move forward, leaving everything past behind forever. The room contained simple but cozy furniture, a table, a few chairs, and a small closet. creating an atmosphere of calm and comfort where every object seemed like a piece of history, and the space was filled with the quiet but meaningful moments of their communication. Leaning towards her a little lower, the man tenderly and a little timidly asked what Fiona really thought of him, what feelings and emotions she kept in her heart, afraid to hear the truth but hoping for sincerity and reciprocity.